And what is up, everybody? Hope we're all having a great afternoon, wonderful night, or whatever time it is in your vicinity. Who's ready for a lit night tonight? Who's ready for a lit night as always? That being said, welcome on into the Lit Dojo, everybody. Welcome on in. I'm your host with the most, Zach Black, the Shogun Master Anime Guardian, at your humble service for tonight's entertainment. Welcome on into the Lit Dojo. Welcome on back, everyone. Hope we're having a great afternoon. You already know it's a bop in here. Gonna turn that music back up again. With that all being said, I hope we're having a great Friday the 13th. You already know it's that time of the year with the supernatural crazy going about. You know, all that superstition goody goody going on. The kind makes you want to shiver in your timbers. But don't worry, don't let that slow you down. Don't let the cracks be a pain in your mama's backs. Don't let the umbrellas cause a storm in your house. And most importantly, watch out for that ladder. You don't want to walk under there. It may not be good for you. With that being said, who's ready to start this now off with a blast? Before we do, welcome in everybody, welcome in. Hope we're all having a swell time, hope we're all doing great. I am just really glad to once again be here tonight. Because last night's stream, I have to say, we really pushed ourselves. We really did. Last night was a huge adventure in itself. Just trial, tribulation, and pushing forward. So I figured tonight we take a break and reward ourselves. Give ourselves a little bit of a mind release. A mind break. So, with that being said, with that being concluded, I thought we'd do something very special. And spend tonight's stream looking at the biology of the supernatural from our fellow scientist compadre, Thought Potato himself. As always, I've always had a huge interest in the supernatural, especially on a biological degree too. Understanding the autonomy, the structure of each supernatural phenomenon. Just further understand the supernatural through the lens of science. So furthermore, we're going to spend tonight's adventure understanding more of the supernatural biology, which is unknown to man's self-proclaimed know-it-all knowledge. Furthermore, for any heads up, just doing a few edits too, doing a few updates on some personal projects. But nonetheless, have no fear, have no fear. Have no fear at all. I've just been working on some things, just been working on some further ideas, working on some special updates for my debut coming up. So, furthermore, I just look forward to a great year. Now the time will be edited, but have no fear, have no fear. My debut will still be on the same date, but it's just the time will be edited for a more later time. But full disclaimer, just heads up, my debut will still be on the 27th. Just time will be rescheduled furthermore. But that aside, referring back to what we were speaking of previously. To recap this week, we've been playing Darksiders a lot, and it's good that we've just been pushing forward. After we beat Darksiders 1, we're going to take a break from the Darksiders franchise and head back to first-person shooters. Just give ourselves a break too. Just give ourselves something to really relieve the tension. Just something to give us a break from all the mind workout. Because while I do enjoy adventure and exploration games, puzzles can be somewhat of an absolute challenge, but then again, they are a test of the shinobi mental endurance. A shinobi's mind must always be strong and ready for not only combat, but also for trials of wit and intelligence. As once famously said by my many senseis centuries ago, a ninja's mind must be ready for all tests and tribulations. So with that being said, Darksiders has been a real challenge of the mind. But have no fear, my faithful viewers, for we shall return. With that being all said, I really look forward to just getting this stream going. But before we do, how's everyone's afternoon doing? Good, that's good. Really look forward to the Sunday stream too, I'm telling you. Not to give any spoilers, but let's just say this Sunday's anime stream is a whole new chapter of how we're going to start doing streams from now on. let's just say, let's just say, I'm here, I'm there, I'm everywhere, and I'm all up in your hair. That being said, look forward to this Sunday's anime reaction stream as we continue with some good old JoJo Bizarre. Golden Wind. That being said, look forward to this Sunday as well. Also, as I previously spoken last stream about my artwork, I am actually almost done too. But I shall not spoil, for I shall always post on my Discord and on my art Twitter. I'm actually quite proud of myself. I have really grown to just get better and better with my artistic talent, and I highly appreciate everyone for their patience in watching me grow as an artist. I will try to do more art streams too, but sometimes when you really love doing stuff, it doesn't always have to be on stream. As long as I am always sharing with my community, that's all that matters. And as always, I'll even share my previous work that I've done so far on stream. It's just all about timing and what I'm going to do for content. But furthermore, I'm just glad that I just thank God that I can come out here and show my talent to my community. It really means a lot. So, furthermore, thank you. Thank you as always. So, with more understanding of this coming schedule and next year's plans, let's just say next year, I plan to dominate. We should make it our top priority, Warriors, to dominate. So, we're going to grind hard throughout this year and the next coming year. Because I'm telling you, this coming year, these coming next 2 years will be a whole new chapter to our story. Alright, this will be a whole new chapter. Meaning whole new adventures as well. Especially in the gaming multiverse. Ever since I first started, I've already had a long, tremendous list of games for us to indulge in for our gaming adventures. Furthermore, I look forward to just even experiencing new games. And as always, if you have any ideas, please do recommend them down in the chat below. It's always appreciated. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and just go ahead and set up and prepare. Go ahead and set up for tonight's entertainment that is within the air. So, with that all being said, sit back, relax, grab your snacks as you prepare for tonight's special entertainment. Gonna go ahead and pull up in 3, 2, and 1. And bingo. That being said, let me just X out some of this stuff. Alright. Tonight, as I have excuse me. I'm so excited. I'm talking in 4th dimension. As I said previously, tonight will be a night of understanding more of the supernatural biology, the autonomy of the unknown, with our good dear friend, Thought Potato. Let me just go ahead and scooch myself down. And without further ado, let me just go ahead and edit this as well. And bap. That being said, let's get into the video. Volume high. And let's get into it. I'm gonna go ahead and just pray over my food first. Amen. Let's get into it. Frankenstein's monster.
Something wasn't right. With each step I'd taken into that forsaken laboratory, a chill ran through me, not from the sterile cold, but from the discoveries that lay, for now, hidden within it. The structure had been built as the result of a question, Can the flame of consciousness be kindled by mortal hands? My discomfort stemmed not from the question itself, but in the realization that one Dr. Alaric, in his hubris and thirst for recognition, had dared to seek its answer. Indeed, in the surrounding region, tales had been whispered of a creature not born, but made, an amalgamation of human fragments forged by advanced machinery. Now, the question isn't just how Dr. Alaric did it, but why. Though my conscience wavers in the telling, my duty as a scientist must supersede it. What you're about to hear is a detailed account of the monster I uncovered in that chamber, of its disparate physiology, and of the technology that engineered flesh and gave it life. We reached Dr. Alaric's decrepit residence, nestled deep within the Ural Mountains, just as night was falling, though perhaps compound is a more appropriate term. Several concrete and glass buildings surrounded the main entrance, each in the process of being reclaimed by windswept drifts of snow. Completely unsure of what we'd find, we proceeded to what appeared to be the entrance of the main building and noticed with some alarm that the front doors were swung wide open. We had received communication that Dr. Alaric had continued his work here despite a loss of funding, and now it was clear that the situation had escalated. Inside, we were greeted by a dark and empty foyer, crumpled papers scuttling along its marbled floor in the growing breeze, and at the end of a lengthy hallway, a faint light shone through another open door. My team and I have witnessed a good many things, but even so, nervous glances were exchanged. At length, we made our way to the source of the light. What we found there was clearly a laboratory, cold and clinical, unlike the areas we'd so far seen. The walls were lined with machinery of all kinds, bundles of wires and terminals and spools of printed paper strewn about the ground. Along the northern wall, a large, intricate piece of machinery spanned for dozens of feet, encased in chrome and brass and riddled with analog dials, switches, and several digital displays. Suspended from the ceiling like a chandelier was what appeared to be a large articulating mechanical arm. Large shelves presented vessels of suspensions and liquids with labels that made little sense to me. Marcus pointed to one of these shelves of vessels, where a single handwritten label sent a chill down my spine. Contagions, it read. Despite the cool of the room, I realized that all three of us were beaded with sweat. Nearby, a human skull lay unassuming, notable for its bizarrely elongated eye teeth. Behind it, an aging topographical map of the United States, with a single red-tipped pin jutting out from the northwestern border of West Virginia. Ancient books littered the numerous steel countertops, tomes of what appeared to be arcane knowledge, and some written in languages I didn't even recognize. Juxtaposed were manila folders of typewritten documents, including a sizable number under the heading Project Starfall, printed on Vita Nova stationery. I must admit that all of this led to a certain feeling of disorientation. One thing was becoming disturbingly clear. Despite my team's extensive experience, we still had much to learn. Questions raced in my mind, and no doubt in all of ours. What was this place? We didn't have long to ponder, however. As we moved to the center of the room, we noticed one unusually clean metallic table, where a single large machine sat, and on it, a small screen with a row of keys below. On its green-hued display, a single phrase blinked. To those who seek. I approached the computer, suddenly unsure of myself. After what we'd seen so far, did we dare uncover more? But as my team gathered around, I knew it was inevitable. I reached for the keyboard and pressed enter. What scrolled on the screen then was the entirety of Dr. Alaric's work, what likely would have been thousands of printed pages. I present to you now an abridged recounting of what he created in that laboratory, deciphered from many tangents and ramblings, for though his intellect was vast, it was clear that he was plagued by the demons that so often accompany genius. As has likely become abundantly clear, this world is filled with the unknown, stories, ecosystems, and yes, beings that defy explanation. Today, writers, video game designers, and
such as mankind's usual nature.
Dungeon masters create their own fantastic worlds, each populated with completely unique creatures, people, and cultures. The problem is, as these worlds grow, it can be difficult to keep track of everything and to build on what you've created. But with World Anvil, even the most complex world building is a breeze. With 25 world building article templates, you can write up detailed accounts and format them in wiki-style presentations. Then map out everything from species and races to regions, characters, diseases, and magic systems, and effortlessly link them with the built-in autolinker function. Plus, World Anvil
Makes it easy to want to make your own fantasy world too. Or if you're playing an animated series, it could also aid in that. Kind of like setting up your own wiki page too, if you could compare it to that.
is always adding new features. One of their more recent features is called Chronicles, which takes some aspects of one of the features I use most, the timeline creation tool, and combines it with geographic mapping, allowing you to plot events across time and space and link them to articles such as your species profiles. Go even deeper with World Anvil's extensive character management features, character sheets, journals, inventory management, and even spell books. Seriously, with World Anvil, the only thing holding you back is your own imagination. So if you want to try out World Anvil for yourself, just visit worldanvil.com and enter code POTATO at checkout for a whopping 51% off any yearly plan. So whether you're a novelist, a dungeon master planning your next campaign, or you're looking to create an alien civilization, if you've got an idea for any world building project, World Anvil is the place to start. Link is in the description.
The creature.
Until this point, my dear
The
listener,
creature. Most people call their ex.
I have omitted a crucial part of the story. You see, I have presented a number of somewhat unbelievable creatures in the past, but even now, even I have difficulty comprehending what we found there, and so I beg your indulgence once more. While most of the lab displayed traditional clinical utilitarianism, embedded in one of the walls was an uncharacteristic stone archway leading to a darkened room. Just a few feet within, large iron bars separated us from what might have been considered a medieval prison cell. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we saw a hulking figure lying lifeless on the bare stone, a muscular human form, its skin taut and studded with stitches, and bizarrely incongruent in pigmentation. Full examination revealed it to be nearly 8 feet tall. Its facial features were strong, barely decayed save for the external nose, which was missing altogether. Its ears were slightly pointed, the supportive cartilage appearing to have collapsed.
Look like Voldemort.
Needless to say, we were astounded. It was clear that this creature had recently been alive, and judging by the utensils and bedding in the cell, may have been so for some time. Unfortunately, the cause of death was likely starvation. Interestingly, we observed no signs of an attempt to escape, even though the creature's sheer mass could likely have damaged the bars that held it. With some difficulty, we extracted the body and began an unorthodox autopsy. As a result of this process, and combined with information gleaned from Dr. Alaric's computer logs, handwritten notes, and video recordings, I was able to piece together not only what this creature was, but how it came to be. Indeed, the creature that lay on that cold slab before us was the culmination of intellect and technology that pushed the boundaries not only of belief, but of science itself. I will waste no time in presenting my conclusions, my valued listener. This adult human, which we pulled from that prison, had been given life mere weeks before, in that very lab, and was an unprecedented amalgamation of disparate human parts, each selected for their physical characteristics, fully grafted together, and somehow made alive. The thought of such an undertaking has existed for centuries, even back to the alchemical homunculi of the
Like a human Barbie doll almost.
16th century. But until this discovery, and for very good reasons, it was never truly thought possible. Perhaps, as it has been with so many discoveries, science had simply awaited the right technology. You see, more than simply separating and splicing together an arm, a leg, or even a skull, Alaric had discovered a way to sequence vast amounts of DNA material, and even to isolate individual genes. But we will return to that point in time. Astoundingly, Dr. Alaric used a combination of connections with local hospitals and morgues to regularly obtain human samples, allowing him to directly source his preferred genetic traits and essentially mold what he considered to be the perfect being. After he
And that's what they always say, to create the perfect being, but you already know anything made by mankind and not of God is never perfect. Only God can create the perfect being. Amen.
obtained his human samples, a process which is left unnervingly without description in his notes, Dr. Alaric was met with the immediate problem of decay. His solution was cryopreservation. The lab was fitted with numerous controlled rate freezing systems, each with a clear objective: to prevent decay of the harvested parts, while preventing the rapid formation of ice that could rupture the cells. Vials of cryoprotective agents such as DMSO, glycerol, and ethylene glycol were found in abundance, each intended to safeguard against the intense chill of the preservation chambers. Tanks of liquid nitrogen flanked these chambers, as did sensitive monitoring equipment designed to detect even the slightest fluctuations in temperature. But while the acquisition and preservation of tissues was an endeavor in itself, it was only the beginning. The real marvel lay in how these tissues were to be used. Scattered throughout Dr. Alaric's central work area were a number of what I would describe as anatomical blueprints, painstaking outlines of human anatomy at both the macro and microscopic levels, down to the very capillaries and nerve endings. Elsewhere, a book of large, detailed photographs chronicled the body assembly process in procedural detail. Special care was given.
So this man literally created a book to specifically build a human body, from the bone to the veins to the flesh to the guts to the brains. Talk about obsession to the highest degree.
Given to the skeletal framework, especially in the regions where entire limbs had been pieced together. Bones were meticulously aligned and attached by way of orthopedic pins and screws, while the application of bone marrow aspirates promoted growth at the junctions, ensuring that they fused almost naturally. Undoubtedly, however, the first major hurdle would be the initial bonding of muscles and tendons from differing samples. It appears that Alaric devised a specialized bioadhesive, primarily composed of highly biocompatible collagen, foundational to the extracellular matrix of many tissues, which naturally provided a scaffold-like structure to anchor the cells. This bioadhesive also incorporated fibrinogen and thrombin, two vital blood proteins, which on contact form fibrin, effectively establishing a natural mesh that not only binds tissue surfaces, but also accelerates wound healing. Simultaneously, at key junctions of the assembled tissues, Alaric introduced what he termed bioelectric scaffolds, infused with conductive, gold-based nanoparticles designed to not only provide structural support, but also to act as a kind of communication system to guide grafted cells to synchronized functions. At each of these junctions of disparate tissue, webs of fine electrode wires were placed on either side of the incisions, each leading back to a large machine that worked to modulate and monitor a steady, low-intensity electrical signal. In turn, amazingly, the scaffolds worked to initiate nerve cell differentiation in regions requiring neural regeneration, as well as muscle cell fusion and alignment. The dual application of the bioadhesive and the scaffolds meant that while tissues were physically bonding, they were also being biologically integrated. But as complex as this process was, it was only the beginning. There was another monumental task: the integration of the circulatory system. To do this, Alaric first utilized precise microsurgical tools to directly connect major blood vessels, a process known as vascular anastomosis. According to Alaric's records, this lengthy and painstaking process was met with numerous challenges, and for the first few test subjects, involved a fair amount of trial and error. The key for Alaric was his bioelectric scaffolds. Dynamic signal modulation combined with meticulous monitoring and sequential programming allowed these structures to target and signal endothelial cells within the tissues to begin angiogenesis. Simultaneously, these signals promoted the healing of stitched vessels and even appeared to modulate platelet behavior, eliminating another hurdle: thrombosis,
So pretty much like a human charger.
or the formation of clots. But of course, the circulatory system would not be complete without something to circulate. My initial assumption was that, given the dissimilar origins of each limb and some organs, Alaric would have to contend with a puzzle of blood types and their intrinsic incompatibilities. However, Alaric's solution was much more simple. Because he had apparently been afforded the luxuries of time and opportunity, he had been precise in the selection of parts, and, as determined by simple blood tests, was able to source only those containing type O blood, the universal donor. Even still,
Hmm.
prior to assembling these parts, Alaric drained as much blood as possible from each part he intended to use. This was achieved through a meticulous flushing procedure where each limb and organ was perfused with a preservation solution, which not only removed the bulk of the original blood, but also provided nourishment to the tissue. After final assembly, fresh type O blood was transfused into the system. But the circulatory system is, of course, more than blood, and viability of a heart large enough to support this creature was crucial, and so Alaric pointedly chose a heart from a donor of substantial physicality. Apparently, however, this search took much more time than anticipated, and Alaric could not afford to wait to begin the body's assembly. In the interim, he utilized a mechanical circulatory support system, a machine of sophisticated pumps, tubes, and sensors. This not only maintained perfusion to the creature's organs before and during the heart's transplantation, it also served to precondition the vascular system in gradually escalating pressures and flows. Once the heart was sutured in place via additional vascular anastomosis, Alaric then faced the monumental task of its reawakening. To accomplish this, he utilized external pacemakers, which deliver rhythmic electrical impulses and would initiate the first contractions. Over time, the reactivated sinoatrial node would take over, providing its own synchronized rhythm.
In short, the energy being transferred throughout the body is being used to obviously hyperstart the heart again. Like 3, 2, 1, clear.
Finally, there was the seat of consciousness itself, the
Hmm.
brain. Alaric had once again been selective, searching for a specimen whose entire head and upper torso fit his ideal build, thus eliminating the need for a brain transplant. According to his logs, he reasoned that the brain itself was less important than the intricacy of the connections it formed over time. This implies, of course, that the cumulative experiences, memories, and synaptic pathways were of far greater significance than the mere organ itself. Rather than grafting a brain into a new environment and forcing integration, Alaric believed that bringing the entire unit, brain, spinal cord, and the cranial structure that housed them, would be more efficient. This would preserve the essential neural networks and provide a framework upon which the rest of the creature could be built. But even after establishing the cadence of the creature's newly implanted heart and essentially integrating its brain, Alaric's next challenge was even greater, stitching together this being's very genetic fabric and blowing open scientific doors I once thought to be forever closed. As previously mentioned, and spanning nearly an entire wall of Dr. Alaric's laboratory, was a machine that ultimately defies explanation. Masses of wires and tubes extended outward, some of which terminated in needles and clamps, like the lifeless tentacles of some eldritch monstrosity. This machine is what granted Alaric an ability he called gene tailoring, the ability to not only isolate specific genes from incomprehensibly complex strands of DNA, but even to recombine them into unique, stable chains tweaked for compatibility. The device seemed to utilize an incredibly advanced molecular scissor mechanism. These scissors were designed to recognize and cleave specific DNA sequences, enabling Alaric to make deliberate insertions, deletions, or replacements within the genomic structure. But perhaps the true marvel was the precision with which the machine could reassemble genetic material. Advanced algorithms far beyond computational abilities I have seen predicted the outcomes of these genetic rearrangements and ensured that the resulting sequences were not only viable, but stable. Furthermore, the machine appeared to incorporate failsafes to prevent certain unintended repercussions of this kind of gene editing. Normally,
Hmm.
almost any attempt to manipulate genetic information results in
So rewrite the genetic code to perfectly match your wants and needs to make a perfect human. Basically just wanting to play God. There are very huge consequences for such acts.
unintended mutations and genetic drift. This gene tailoring machine, however, appeared to have some sort of advanced error correction system that cross referenced the edited sequences with a vast database of genetic information and ensured that the edited genes remained consistent and error-free. Alaric's notes on how this technology came into his possession are absent altogether, and I must admit my own curiosity, as it was truly unlike anything I had ever seen. Sadly, the opportunity to study its systems in detail has long passed. Perhaps time and more mainstream science will one day shed light on its true capabilities. What I can discern indicates that this gene tailoring process produced cellular amalgamations that Alaric then nurtured in a nutrient-rich medium that included fetal bovine serum, various antibiotics, growth
Hmm.
factors, hormones, and buffering agents, and provided an ideal environment for rapid multiplication. Perhaps more amazingly, Alaric was able to insert this tailored genetic material into harvested mammalian cells, then directly to rats, and eventually escalating to a different method of delivery. Indeed, at a certain point, the
Hmm.
question of how to introduce this edited genetic information into the creation cells provided a major roadblock. In order for the tissues and organs to function cohesively in their newly assembled form, they needed a shared genetic language. Fortunately for Alaric, nature already had a solution. Over countless eons, viruses have become supremely efficient at transferring their genetic material into host cells. Alaric realized that stripped of their pathogenic nature, they could be repurposed as vehicles, vectors to carry the desired genes into target tissues.
Hmm.
I noticed a recurring reference to a particular viral strain that seemed unusual. Its genetic makeup didn't completely match any known database, and there was a cryptic nature to it, a structure that seemed to match certain known contagions, but strangely altered. Alaric's descriptions of its origins were frustratingly sparse, which suggests that he, for reasons unknown to me, intended to hide its true
Hmm.
nature. In any case, Alaric used this modified virus to deliver the intricately tailored genetic sequences into the harvested tissues. He did this through direct injection, but he also guided it through a process known as electroporation. In this process, transient pores in the cell membrane are opened via controlled electric fields, in essence guiding vectors deep into the tissues. Here, the electric field's frequency, pulse duration, and strength were meticulously calibrated to match each tissue type by their unique electrophysiological properties. Muscle tissues, for example, are inherently more electrically conductive and require different stimulation parameters than less conductive tissues like fat or bone. Once these vectors penetrated the cell's defenses, the introduced genes, carrying Alaric's meticulously crafted sequences, found their way into the nucleus. There they integrated with the host cell's own DNA. For Alaric's creation, the success of this stage was absolutely critical. Without it, the tissues, while structurally integrated, would lack the synchronized function of a naturally formed organism. It was this synchronization, driven by a shared genetic blueprint, that would give this creature at least some semblance of life. Of course, in assembling his creature, Alaric encountered another fundamental biological challenge: the natural immune defense, designed to repel and reject any foreign cells introduced to a system. Once more, Alaric leveraged his gene tailoring techniques, strategically modifying the creature's cellular major histocompatibility complex molecules and effectively masking them from the immune system's radar. Without this step, upon completion, the creature would be at constant odds with its own tissues, its immune system launching continuous assaults on what it perceived as invasive cells. And so, Alaric felt that he had assessed and accounted for virtually every outcome. He and his creation were ready. Now, in the final stages of assembly, Alaric implemented mechanical systems that stimulated muscle contraction and rhythmically expanded the lungs. Nerves pulsed with potential, and aided by electrical stimuli, the heart began to beat. There, bathed in the dim glow of monitors and machines, a moment was coming, and there was little doubt that Alaric's own heart beat rapidly within his chest. Like the last tentative impacts of an aircraft's wheels just before the air catches its wings, Alaric's creation shuddered and trembled with energy. And, in a way, it too was about to take flight.
Hmm.
Though until this point Alaric's progress had been recorded on paper and digitally, the next phase was recorded on tape. That tape was
All right. So far, the John, the gene tailoring its genetic makeup to fit the perfect suited needs and wants of its creator. Honestly, it's like just playing jigsaw puzzle with the human anatomy. try to make whatever you want out of random parts. It's like what mankind is keen to do. Take what believes or thinks that it knows and to make whatever it wants out of it. Man, when will man learn not to tamper with things that has none of its business to tamper with?
Was lost, along with the rest of Alaric's work, but I still remember it vividly. The creature, or rather the person on the slab, trembled as the machines designed to sustain its body wound down. Alaric stood over it, exuding a restless wonder. The creature's chest continued to rise and fall, even as Alaric removed the compression device. Its eyes opened slowly, undramatically, and it began to move. Expressions cycled across its face, a grimace, wide-eyed bewilderment, something like fear. A moment later, its eyes squeezed shut and stayed closed for a time, though it continued to breathe. We watched the tape in dumbfounded fascination. Somehow, the experiment had been a success, and the tape continued. The creature's first days were marked by a mixture of bewilderment and instinctual learning. Its enormous eyes would focus intently on objects, seeming to attempt to absorb details with an insatiable curiosity. Movements were initially tentative, each limb flexing and testing its strength, slowly learning to coordinate with the rest of its body. Alaric often observed from behind reinforced glass, taking copious notes on the creature's behaviors. He marveled over what he saw: rapid neuroplasticity, progressing from crawling to standing to walking in mere days. Its intelligence became apparent when it began to mimic sounds from its environment, eventually attempting rudimentary speech. However, its existence was not without challenges. Despite Alaric's planning, the creature faced certain post-operative complications. Infections, graft rejections, and minor seizures were but a few of the obstacles. The creature also exhibited signs of existential distress, episodes where it would gaze for long moments into mirrors or at its own hands. Interestingly, it appeared to shy away from the daylight that entered the laboratory through its few windows. Interactions with Alaric varied. At times, the creature would regard him with what seemed to be reverence, touching his face almost tenderly. At other times, it displayed frustration, pounding at floors, shelving, and its own body. Despite these challenges, the creature's adaptability was remarkable. Within weeks, it apparently began to exhibit problem-solving skills, manipulating objects, and even showing signs of creativity, crafting primitive art from materials in its enclosure. Even still, Alaric himself appeared less and less frequently in the same room as his creation. Additionally, it was clear from his notes that the being to whom he gave life was becoming a source of anxiety. "I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation," he wrote, "but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." The final video recording shows Alaric leading the creature to its cell by a rope tied loosely to its wrists. It was an odd sight, given that the creature towered over Alaric, and yet it showed no signs of resistance, even as the iron door closed. Alaric then returns to the camera, reaching for the switch. A brief expression crosses his face, something like regret, rapidly replaced by determination. The screen goes dark. I have yet to determine what happened to Alaric, or his motivations as to the cruel abandonment of his creation. Disturbingly, he left a cryptic letter addressed specifically to me that I am reluctant to share here. I will share, however, a particularly intriguing passage gleaned from his final journal entry, dated mere days before we arrived. "Perhaps the mortal body, tailored to near perfection though it may have been, is no longer suitable to host these mighty spirits, those who still hold the fire. I do not regret my work, however. We are particles, and it is clear that by sheer will, even dust can be revived. I have long wondered if the flame of consciousness could ever truly be kindled by mortal hands. I see now that perhaps it cannot, but it can be stolen." This video was made possible by World Anvil and by viewers like you. Thank you. And remember, you matter.
Always.
Now, if you'd like to read...
Well, gotta say, Frankenstein biology is quite fascinating. The concept of a human trying to create another human, or again, keyword attempts. Some things must never ever be attempted, period. For we think we truly know what creates a man, but we don't. And that shows within our own faults of why our own creations falter in comparison to the one only creator. That being said, though, religious poetry aside, Frankenstein monster is just made out of different parts. And really, it's like it takes a lot to make one being. You pretty much have to control, you have to program the neurosystem, the nervous system, every bodily system, period. It's a lot of work. A lot of work indeed.
A mummy. Is it dead or alive? Human or inhuman? You'll know. You'll see.
In the quiet recesses of an ancient tomb, an embalmed body lies in perpetual repose. Suddenly, the eons of silence are disturbed, quietly at first, then growing louder. The mummy stirs, its limbs twitching, ancient tissues crackling in an uncanny semblance of life. It emerges from its ornate vessel, staggering, arms outstretched, seeking swift revenge on any who might have awakened it from its eternal slumber. The popular image of this shambling corpse is disturbing, with its features, though taut and sunken, still recognizable after so many centuries. In some ways, the visage of the mummy seems to mock the natural order, a stark defiance of entropy. Perhaps that is why we fear it. In the mummy, we see a horrifying reflection of our own mortality, frozen on a face of desiccated flesh. But contrary to the undead creature you might have seen in the motion pictures, my valued listener, there is life here, though it is certainly not as you might expect. I present to you today a mystery that has intrigued scholars and stirred imaginations for centuries, and one that I have found to be entirely grounded in scientific reality. The legend of the reanimated mummy. My own interest in ancient Egypt and its practices of mummification began when I was young. News articles of findings in that distant land were endlessly fascinating, and though the initial wave of so-called Egypt mania, triggered by the momentous uncovering of Tutankhamun's tomb in 22, had ebbed by the time I entered university, I have always held the subject close. So when I was approached by a large pharmaceutical company just weeks prior to my graduation, I was both confused and intrigued. My initial concerns as to what possible interest a pharmaceutical company like Vtuber could have in ancient Egyptian burial practices were set aside the moment they presented me with a position and a salary I had previously thought unattainable, especially directly out of school. And so, a few months thereafter, I traveled to Egypt. As part of my directive, I met with several local academics, as well as 2 teams of individuals who had recently uncovered something they could not explain. As we approached the secure location that held the remains I would examine for the next few weeks, I sensed deep reservations on the part of my hosts. And I must admit, as I began my work in earnest, my own pulse began to quicken. What I discovered there was an ancient form of life that is as wondrous as it is disturbing. And as usual, my valued listener, I implore you to set aside your preconceived notions of biological possibility as I present to you Cryptomycota aegyptiaca, or as some have called it, the Egyptian necrospore.
Oh,
It's a big world, and there's a lot to learn. No matter where you are in life, I've found that there's never a bad time to reinvent your goals, your career, and yourself. Now, you may already know Skillshare for its classes in photography, film and video editing, and illustration, but did you know that Skillshare has hundreds of career-focused classes too? Personally, I've made a few goals for myself this year, and one of them was to explore even more creative options. I've really enjoyed trying to enhance my skills in drawing anatomy, as well as learning the process of digital painting. But even more than that, these classes have helped me find my own creative style, which will hopefully even improve future videos.
perhaps someday I might even use websites like these, really. Websites that make creating worlds and fan fiction lore, I find very tremendous and very well brought together. Really gives people a good, detailed idea of how everything's put together. Very, very grand indeed.
Ultimate goal for this year is to quit my day job and essentially work for myself, doing something I really enjoy. Unfortunately, I tend to be pretty
Excuse me if I
terrible at
haven't been
organization.
talking much either, chat. I'm just very fascinated with Finn listening to him. He has a very entrancing voice at the same time. Just trying to stay energetic, but don't worry. I'm still in tuned, y'all. I'm still in tuned. Furthermore, the concept of the mummy, I've always found interesting too, of how the mummy works. Is it dead or alive? Only one way to find out.
And time management, especially in planning and synthesizing research for my videos, so I was very excited to discover Ali Abdal's Notion Masterclass. I'm still tweaking my perfect setup, but it's already been immensely helpful in tracking where my videos are in their process, all in their own dashboard. Just in general, keeping everything organized has made me way more productive and has taken me one step closer to my ultimate goal. Of course, when it comes to planning and setting goals for the future, it can get intimidating fast. Fortunately, Skillshare makes it easy to start small with more bite-sized ways to learn and with teachers that take you step by step. Now, if you'd like to redefine your own work or achieve a new goal for yourself, you can explore all of Skillshare's offerings for free for a limited time. That's right, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So take ownership of your own career path and ultimately your future, learn a new skill, and discover what Skillshare has to offer today. Click the link below to embark on the next phase of your journey. The practice of mummification, particularly as it occurred in ancient Egypt, is a process that sailed along the line between life and death. It began with a delicate and macabre procedure, the extraction of the organs. The brain, deemed unnecessary for the afterlife, was pulverized via a long rod inserted through the nasal cavity and subsequently drained out. The heart, considered the seat
That's
of the
nasty.
soul, was left untouched, a lone sentinel in a hollowed-out body. The body was then bathed in natron, a type of salt, which leached the moisture from the flesh, transforming pliable skin into a hardened, leathery shell. This stage frequently lasted for 40 days or more, a transformative period where the body was purged of its mortal frailties and prepared for an eternal journey. Once the body was sufficiently desiccated, it was anointed with aromatic oils and resins, substances chosen not only for their preservative qualities, but also for their symbolic significance. The body was then meticulously wrapped in linen, each layer serving as a protective barrier. Protective charms were often tucked within the linen wrappings, their mystical properties intended to safeguard the deceased in the afterlife. The final act of this solemn process was the placement of the mummy in its sarcophagus, the closing of which signaled a final farewell from the realm of the living. Years pass, sometimes thousands, yet these bodies often remain remarkably well preserved. In my time with several previously exhumed specimens, I must admit that even I was surprised at the level of preservation found therein, and I can't deny an admiration for those who laid the body to rest. In these specimens, though sunken and shriveled, the epidermis remained intact, even at the microscopic level, with cell layers, nuclei, and desmosomes still easily recognizable. Collagen fibrils and elastic dermal fibers were often also well preserved. The internal organs, however, are reduced to shriveled remnants, if they remain at all. Yet they too have been preserved, their structure still discernible after millennia. The heart, especially, left untouched during the mummification process, is consistently found in its place. But in these embalmed bodies, perhaps the greatest point of note is the level of preservation observable in the muscle tissue. I have directly observed intact boundaries in striated muscle cells, indicating preserved cell membranes, as well as the presence of collagen type 1, indicating a robust maintaining of connective tissues. In certain specimens, I was unable to detect many more subcellular organelles, but in others, where preservation was particularly impressive, I was astoundingly able to discern intact sarcomeric units, namely actin and myosin. We'll return to this point in due time, but in summary, it appears that in these specific specimens, the muscle structure was remarkably intact, despite its vast age. But in truth, as I'm sure you've come to gather, and as intriguing as it is, the subject of my study was not ancient human preservation techniques. What led me to this distant land was the same thing that had so frightened those who first discovered it, in the modern era at least. I beg your indulgence for a moment, my valued listener, as I provide some context. Among the linens binding the bodies of 2 specimens I observed were a series of hieroglyphs. These cryptic images relayed a story that has been entirely lost to time, until now. Thousands of years before my arrival in Egypt, a group of priests gathered around an embalming table, their subject laid in front of them. Vessels of fluid, Instruments and scrolls lay nearby, placed carefully for the sacred work ahead. One of these vessels, however, contained something unique, neither plant nor animal. It was not dead, but neither was it living. It appears that a splinter sect of priests calling themselves something like the Order of the Resurrected Sun chose for their deity Khepri, the scarab face god of the morning sun. This cult was granted a sacred gift, a physical manifestation of Khepri's power over life and death. They referred to this gift as the Seeds of the Eternal Dawn, and in stark contrast to traditional Egyptian beliefs, this cult saw it as a way to manipulate the natural order of death and the journey to the afterlife. Indeed, these seeds were thought to bring Khepri's power of resurrection directly to the physical body, granting an obscene form of life that was undoubtedly regarded as blasphemous to anyone outside the order. This cult added these seeds to the resins and oils normally used for the process of embalming, effectively spreading them throughout the mummifying tissues. The body was then laid inside of a sarcophagus, with extra care given to sealing the heavy covering. There the bodies remained for millennia, the seeds of the eternal dawn lying dormant within, waiting for the opportune time to reawaken. It will likely come as no surprise, my valued listener, that though their precise origin is yet unknown, the seeds of the eternal dawn were no mystical nor metaphysical substance. Indeed, these seeds are the spores of a fungus I have tentatively named Cryptomycota aegyptiaca. It is my hypothesis that this fungus is a member of Hippocreols, an order that includes many families, including
So fungi. How fun indeed.
Ophiocordyceps, the infamous zombie ant parasite. Though more research is necessary to determine Aegyptiaca's precise taxonomy, I can safely say that, at the very least, it is a sac fungi of phylum Ascomycota. Like Ophiocordyceps, Aegyptiaca is a parasitic fungus with a specific definitive host. But of course, rather than insects, this particular fungus is anthropopathogenic, specialized to infect humans. This alone is a momentous discovery, as until now, no fungus capable of influencing human movement patterns has been identified. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I can elaborate on how a fungus can manipulate a human host, I had to know how any form of life could survive for millennia within a dark, sealed tomb. For fungi, however, the answer is well documented. Upon sealing of the sarcophagus, conditions that would otherwise promote germination are reduced, such as temperatures and nutrient supplies. This causes the fungus to activate a series of genetic and biochemical responses. First, through the deposition of additional layers of chitin and melanin, the cell wall is thickened, providing protection against physical and chemical stressors, including desiccation and nutrient deprivation. Second is the downregulation of metabolic activity, such as the expression of genes that minimize energy expenditure and resource preservation. In short, the fungus enters a state of prolonged exogenous dormancy. These processes are not unheard of in documented fungi, but I have observed that the cells of Aegyptiaca are particularly well suited for extraordinarily long-term resource deprivation. It appears that the cytoplasm of its spores is both exceptionally viscous and acidic, altering the solubility of its proteins, including metabolic enzymes. Interestingly, the mummification techniques employed specifically by the Order of the Resurrected Sun appear to have resulted in much greater moisture retention than traditional mummies. I believe that this was accomplished through two primary means. First, the sarcophagi were sealed by what appears to be a unique mixture of resin, beeswax, and clay, all of which formed a nearly impenetrable barrier and maintained a kind of homeostasis within the coffin. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the mummies themselves were wrapped in linen bandages soaked in a solution of similar resins that, when dried, likely retain a certain amount of moisture. Interestingly, the fungal spores present in the body at the time of burial do not absorb moisture until germination, a process prompted by a change in certain environmental conditions, such as when the tomb is disturbed. Throughout the time since these tombs were sealed, the treasures housed within have called to many. While some, especially in recent times, were more noble in their quest to uncover these tombs, others were decidedly less so. In either case, once the eons of arrested time harbored within these sarcophagi have been disturbed, a cascade of changes take place within the mummy's fungal infection. First, upon exposure to oxygen, the biophysical properties of the cells are awakened from their viscous dormancy. My observations indicate that metabolic activity significantly escalates, leading to a swift increase in the production of proteins, DNA, and RNA. Interestingly, this is the point, after so many centuries, that the spores begin to uptake any surrounding water, and may triple or even quadruple in diameter. These changes are catalyzed by a group of specialized proteins that appear to act as molecular chaperones, which, under periods of extreme environmental stress, help other proteins from becoming misfolded or aggregated. Specifically, in response to an influx of oxygen, a heat shock protein I have named FSPX appears to catalyze the transformation of both the cytoplasm's level of viscosity and the reactivation of metabolic processes. FSPX also appears to resolubilize certain proteins, which itself facilitates a more fluid environment within the cells, further increasing their metabolism. Crucially, the sequence of reawakening the fungal cells triggers another process: rapid and widespread growth throughout the mummified body. From each of the spores, one or more germ tubes begin to protrude, growing in a characteristic pattern directed away from the spore's apex. These tubes are actually the early stages of hyphal growth, the filamentous structures that form the primary architecture of the fungal network, itself known as the mycelium. As these germ tubes extend, they branch and interconnect, creating a complex web of hyphae. In the specimens I examined, it was clear that these filaments extend across and, to a staggering extent, infiltrate nearly all of the mummified tissues. But as with other fungal growths, this hyphal network is not a passive structure. As previously mentioned, it is actively involved in the extraction and absorption of nutrients from these tissues, enabling the fungus to grow and proliferate. Simultaneously, the hyphae also serve as conduits for the transport of nutrients and signaling molecules. This allows the fungus to coordinate its activities across the entire mummified body, effectively turning the mummy into a single, interconnected fungal organism, a kind of extended phenotype exhibiting a level of sophistication that has, in the modern era, never been observed in detail. In other parasitic fungal infections, the entire interior of the host body, seen in certain ants for example, may be essentially replaced with the fungus itself. Not only this, but individual fungus cells will act cooperatively to form an interconnected community around mandibular muscle cells in the infected ant, separating muscle fibers and degrading motor neurons, which in turn causes the ant to bite down on a leaf and never let go. The fungus, Ophiocordyceps in this example, then produces hyphal outgrowths from the body's orifices, anchoring the body to its substrate, while the saprophytic mycelium, consisting of lipid-rich storage bodies, colonizes and mummifies the insect cadaver. Interestingly, and contrary to popular belief, at the time of death, this fungus is found everywhere in the ant's body, except the brain. In human mummies, however, most of this hard work of bodily transformation was accomplished by the embalmers. And so, as the hyphal network penetrates the mummified tissues, it finds an environment perfectly suited for its habitation, in all ways, that is, except nutrients. As a result, the fungus is forced to seek out a more hospitable location, and upon germination, it will do so, through precise manipulation of the flesh that contains it. On average, it takes roughly 48 hours for the fungal mycelium to infiltrate the atrophied muscle tissue to a level necessary for the next stage of its life cycle. By this time, the mummy itself, having been exhumed by robbers or academics, may yet remain in its tomb. It may also be mid-transport, or even, in rare cases, at its destination, perhaps in the back room of a museum or other facility. Suddenly, its coverings begin to undulate, moved by the contractions of muscles that haven't been flexed for thousands of years. In jerking, halting, shambling movements, it exits its confinement, ancient bones cracking and snapping as its upright body struggles to support its own weight. The terror that would undoubtedly consume any observer to this macabre puppetry is primal. Fortunately, as we have already seen, even this disturbing sight can be fully explained by scientific means. As the exploratory hyphae extend into key motor muscles, especially those in the legs, as well as stabilizers in the hips and lower trunk, it will inevitably encounter residual neural structures, and what happens next is a hallmark wholly unique to this species. Nestled within the depths of the spinal cord lies a kind of neural network, a true wonder of biological engineering referred to as a central pattern generator, or CPG. These neural networks are capable of producing rhythmic, patterned outputs even in the absence of sensory feedback, and elsewhere in the body, they are responsible for controlling a variety of automatic, rhythmic behaviors, such as breathing and swallowing. In fact, the rhythm of these outputs require no input nor oversight from the brain itself, unless a conscious effort is made to override them. One of the most notable patterns controlled by a CPG is also one of the most complex: locomotion. It has been well established that while the brain can and does control locomotion, CPGs within the lumbar spinal cord, along with their associated webs of neurons, can function completely independently from the brain and can even adapt different gaits based on terrain, all without relaying signals to the brain. Indeed, the directing of these activities are inherent to the structure and connections of the neurons in the CPG circuits. In its imperative to find a more suitable environment, it is this very particular biological feature that Aegyptiaca exploits. I must admit that more study is necessary to determine the full extent of the biological mechanisms that are employed by the fungus, but at this time, it appears that as the fungal outgrowths come into contact with the astonishingly preserved neurons associated with locomotion, a class of fungal proteins I have named neural residue interpreters, or NRIs, are expressed. These NRIs appear to bind to the remnants of voltage-gated sodium ion channels, which are essential for the propagation of action potentials in neurons. At a high level, this allows these proteins to identify residual neural patterns. Then, through the activation of a series of enzymes, such as protein kinase C, the NRIs trigger a signaling pathway within the fungal cells, which in turn leads to the production of specific signaling molecules, which I call fungal neuromuscular modulators. In short, it appears that these modulators are designed to mimic the neurotransmitters that would have been released by the neurons in the CPGs in a living host. If, for example, the residual neural pattern indicates that acetylcholine would have been released at a certain time, the fungus produces an FNM that specifically mimics acetylcholine. As you might have guessed, the fungal cell will then release its acetylcholine mimic into the intramuscular spaces, which it has infiltrated. There, it binds with nicotinic acetylcholine receptors found on the host's muscle cell membranes. This, of course, triggers the influx of sodium ions, leading to a depolarization.
In short, it rebonds the muscle tissues within. That explains the stiff joint movements mummies have.
Of the membrane, which triggers the release of calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum within the muscle cell. The calcium ions then bind to troponin, a protein that regulates muscle contraction, ultimately leading to the contraction of the muscle fiber. Amazingly, the fungal mycelium essentially appears to act simultaneously as a middleman of sorts, reading residual neural signals while also functioning as a rudimentary nervous system itself, expressing neurotransmitter mimics to preserved muscle tissues. Indeed, the extensive network of fungal hyphae lends itself to this very function. Interestingly, the fungus appears to interface specifically with the CPG responsible for forward locomotion and no others. In short, infected mummies can only move a single direction, forward. But while this process is endlessly fascinating, the fungus now faces another problem. The body it inhabits may now be mobile, but the intervening millennia have made it weak and fragile. Fortunately, the mycelium serves yet another purpose here. As the pattern obtained from the locomotor CPG coordinates forward bipedal movement, the mycelium is able to sense mechanical changes, such as those in pressure and distortion to its hyphal bodies. Indeed, mechanosensation is a well-documented phenomenon in fungi, facilitated by ion channels in the fungal cell membrane. In Aegyptiaca, this allows the fungal outgrowths to respond to muscular imbalances in legs and hips by triggering additional hyphal growth. This, in turn, provides...
I'll be right back, my faithful viewers. I shall return momentarily. For now, let's do some go jams like always. BRB, warriors. And we're back, warriors. Thanks for your patience always. Just had to take a little break to check on my family, but we're A-OK. That being said, do a little stretch. Alright, Autobots, let's roll on back to the video.
Provides a kind of structural scaffolding that lends support to the lower half of the cadaver. Additionally, in those regions where muscle strength is lacking, the hyphae can even mimic the arrangement of muscle fibers. As has been observed in other fungal infections, these filaments are capable of exerting mechanical force, effectively replacing the function of degraded muscle tissue in the case of severe decomposition. And
So basically what he's trying to say is that the fungal enters the bone matter and replaces muscle fiber and circulatory functions as kind of like a parasitic mechanism, kind of like how some parasites take over insects, mainly, as I recall, one that takes over wasps and ants. There are some parasites that actually do that, even after an animal or even a bigger organism were to pass away. Some parasites are known for actually entering the corpse and taking over. Some call it, in a play on words, zombification. Some call it zombification. Some others call it necromorphosis. So basically, it's kind of like the same concept. The fungus enters the bones. It takes over. It takes about maybe, say, a week's or even a month's tops, depending on the amount of moisture too. But let's not go too far deep into that. That's but a different topic, as we'll soon further venture into.
so the fungus, now in control of the mummy's movements, begins its search for a more hospitable environment. Possibly aided by photoreceptors, a concept not unheard of in this kingdom, the fungus guides the mummy toward areas of higher humidity and temperature, conditions that are more conducive to fungal growth. And still, there is one last hurdle the fungus must overcome. Despite the efforts of the embalmers to preserve as much fuel for the fungus as possible, the centuries have taken their toll, and the host body's store of nutrients are quickly depleted. Mummies are only capable of movement for very brief periods of time. In my observations, upright locomotion ends within approximately 4 to 6 minutes.
That's right, like you said earlier. Over time, think of it. Back then, centuries ago, when the Egyptians were trying to preserve the bodies, their ideology of medicine and medical instruments, their ideology was based on the afterlife. They believed in trying to preserve the worthy organs that dictate their passage into the afterlife, mainly the heart, as, like in their belief, if their heart was lighter than the feather, it meant that their heart was pure, righteous, and was deserving of passing into a form of Havana. But if their heart was heavier than the feather, then it's kind of like, no, they're not worthy. Kind of like in Christian religion, like how there's both a heaven and a hell. That's kind of like how the Egyptians almost saw it, but different. But as described in this particular topic, think of how the Egyptians tried to preserve the body. Now, honestly, a corpse can only last but so much, since their methods were different from ours of today. Today we have scientists who could better preserve the body, like in the mortuary, with different chemicals and embalming fluids that can better preserve the tissues, the organs, kind of like how some hospitals use the organs of past people to replace body parts. But to better interpret this, imagine like centuries later, a corpse reactivating its muscle functions. It would be decayed, broken down, kind of like if a car was to activate, but it has a dead battery. It's rusty. The functions are out of conditioning. So think of it like that. The body wouldn't function properly like it used to because it's corroded, decayed. It can only use but so much based off of what the parasitic fungus can do with the muscles. It's pretty much like borrowing, a broken down machine. You can only do but so much. That's a very interesting concept too, with especially the organism being decayed. That's a very different concept we have to focus on versus if it was a living organism. But of course, mummies aren't really living, but you know, as you further into this topic, we'll further understand.
However, even after the cadaver has ceased to walk, it will exhibit irregularly timed convulsions for an additional 10 to 20 minutes, gradually reducing in frequency and severity. If left undisturbed, the fungus will then enter the next phase of its life cycle,
Hmm.
dispersal. After the mummy has collapsed, the body-wide mycelium that provided structural support proliferates further in the nearly empty chest and abdominal cavities. From either the anterior or posterior region of the torso, depending on how the body fell, a new structure erupts, the fruiting body. This process, known
Hmm.
as sporulation, is the culmination of the fungus's parasitic journey and marks its transition from parasitic to reproductive phase. The first sign of this transition is the differentiation of certain hyphal cells into sporogenous cells. These cells, which are genetically programmed to become the architects of the fruiting body, begin to proliferate and differentiate into a complex, three-dimensional structure called the stroma, which serves as the foundation for the fruiting body and provides structural support necessary for its growth.
And to add into that, like he's saying with the fungus, that's true. Some fungus have a habit of, well, like with any plant or organic living being, there is always a need to multiply to further bear itself. So, in the case of this being affecting a corpse, it's obvious with time passing, if left unbothered or irritated, the fungus would then, of course, spread throughout the body, thus gaining more, to better put in better terms, more functional functional control. Still, this being a decayed body won't be perfect, but you'll still have more locomotion. Kind of like replacing the joints, the veins, kind of like adding more control around the bones. Still jaded and still not fully. What's the correct term I could use? Not fully articulate with the body motions. Thank you, chat. Not fully articulate with the body motions. It's kind of like how, and I'll use the better understand. It's kind of like, say, if a person's arm was removed but then reattached. It would take time for a living, already organic living being's body parts to fully develop that same speed and reaction again, versus this being a decayed organism. So it's kind of the fungi's only, again, using what it is only giving, depending on the situation of the organism. Now, of course, again, this being a dead organism, it's only using what it can use. So if the organism can't be used for any further advance, then its only next option would be to multiply and possibly spread onto another organism with better benefits. Pretty much like, if you would, in a sense, take it as like kind of like migration a little, but on a different cellular level.
Growth. As the stroma develops, the sporogenous cells continue to differentiate into various specialized cell types. Some of these cells become the asci, the sac-like structures that will eventually house the spores. Others become the periphyses, sterile cells that provide structural support and help to create the microenvironment necessary for spore development. Once the spores are fully formed, the fruiting body matures and prepares for the final stage of sporulation. Spore dispersal. When the conditions are right, the ascus undergoes a process known as ascal dehiscence, in which it builds up turgor pressure and then ruptures, forcibly ejecting the spores into the environment. This process can launch
Precisely right there, like we just talked about. When it's time for spores to have to move on to another host, like most parasites do, if the host is already dead, it doesn't serve it anymore. It has to move on to another host. If not, it will perish. So it has to move on to another bear source. Like they say, it has to move on to where the grass is greener. That's one good way of putting it.
spores several meters away from the mummy, ensuring their wide dispersal. The ejected spores then begin their own journey, carried by the wind, water, or other vectors, ultimately in search of a new host to infect. At this
That or even smaller organisms too, like say ants, smaller insects, or even, well, mainly insects too, or even other organisms like maybe birds or a squirrel to pass on the parasite, furthering the advancement of the fungi, the bacteria, or the, well, again, parasite, to keep it simple.
this point, you may be wondering, just as I did, what might occur if these spores were inhaled or otherwise ingested by a living human host. Fortunately, from the perspective of scientific study at least, thanks to the groups that initially discovered the 2 specimens I examined, I was able to observe this directly. As we've seen, Cryptomycota aegyptiaca is able to infect, inhabit, reanimate, and reproduce from a single dead body. However, its effects on living bodies are much different. First, the fungus is ill-equipped to deal with the human immune system, as well as its high average body temperature. Second, the conditions necessary for its proliferation are not ideal in a living host. In other hosts, such as insects, parasitic fungi are known to degrade neuronal function as well as muscle tissue, leading to a desired outcome in mandibular movement as well as eventual death, and only then can the fungus reproduce. In humans, the processes necessary to infiltrate and degrade living tissue are likely too complex to effect in any sufficiently widespread manner, especially in the presence of the immune system. In theory, this could be overcome by infecting the brain directly, but even if the fungus could penetrate the blood-brain barrier, it would need to have adapted specifically in a way that would allow it to manipulate the brain at all. This is simply not the case for Cryptomycota aegyptiaca, at least not yet. Similarly, the body of a deceased human, undergoing normal decaying processes, is also not ideal. In short, it appears that mummified and desiccated muscle tissue provides the ideal substrate for the proliferation of hyphal bodies in the ample spaces between muscle fibers. But even still, living organisms are not entirely immune from the effects of this fungus. As previously mentioned, the opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun some years ago sparked a widespread interest in all things having to do with ancient Egypt. But as several members of the team that discovered this famous tomb began to die under
Tutankhamun, or famously known as King Tut.
mysterious circumstances, many speculated that their hubris in disturbing the pharaoh's place of rest had placed them under a curse. Whether or not these particular individuals experienced any negative side effects as a result of their discovery is unsubstantiated. However, the concept of the mummy's curse may have some grounds in reality. As one might expect, I have found residual spores of Cryptomycota aegyptiaca, as well as dormant hyphal bodies lining the sarcophagus, certain parts of the enclosing tomb, as well as upon the surface of the burial linens. Undoubtedly, as the tombs of these particular mummies are disturbed, trespassers often inadvertently release these dormant spores into the air. The sudden exposure to light, oxygen, or changes in temperature likely trigger the germination of these spores, leading to the initial stages of fungal growth. This could occur on the surfaces of the tomb, on the artifacts within, or even within the bodies of the tomb raiders themselves if they inhale or come in contact with the spores directly. Initial symptoms are subtle, usually causing only mild symptoms or going unnoticed entirely. But as the spores begin to germinate and grow, they can cause a range of symptoms that may be initially mistaken for an allergic reaction or a benign respiratory infection. However, as the fungal cells continue to grow and multiply, they can cause more serious symptoms, which can include shortness of breath and a persistent productive cough. Some individuals may even experience fatigue, weight loss, and a general feeling of malaise. In severe cases, the fungus can cause a condition known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis, a type of lung inflammation that occurs when the immune system overreacts to the presence of the fungal cells in the lungs. Symptoms of hypersensitivity pneumonitis can include fever, chills, and difficulty breathing, and can lead to permanent lung damage. In most cases, these symptoms will resolve on their own once the individual is no longer exposed to the fungal spores, and as previously mentioned, a healthy immune system and adverse internal conditions will prevent additional growth within the body. As such, the curse of the mummy, while grounded in reality, is unlikely to cause long-term damage to anyone exposed to it. Still, when encountering any embalmed body from this time period, the use of a face covering is highly recommended. Cryptomycota Trichoda aegyptiaca is a remarkable organism, a testament to the ingenuity of nature and the mysteries of our own ancient past. Its origins are deeply intertwined with the rituals and beliefs of a long-lost civilization, a sect of ancient Egyptian embalmers who saw in this fungus a sacred gift, a means to bestow upon their deceased a semblance of life beyond death. However misguided this may have been, there is a question that pulls at me still. Why has this species not been found elsewhere, neither before nor since? At the time of my report, I cited the unique circumstances surrounding its discovery and the specific conditions required for its growth as an explanation for why this fungus is not found elsewhere. It makes some sense. The meticulous embalming process, the arid climate of Egypt, and the undisturbed sanctity of the tombs created an environment perfectly suited for the preservation and eventual reawakening of this fungus. But in truth, I still do not know where these ancient priests found this species, growing wild as it undoubtedly did, nor do I know how they ascertained the extent of its life cycle, or the exact techniques they used to ensure its survival. Sadly, this knowledge has likely been lost to time. Worse, there are times when my confidence in Aegyptiaca's inability to infect living humans wanes. After all, the potential for adaptation is a hallmark of fungal organisms. Given the right circumstances, it is not inconceivable that this fungus could adapt to overcome the barriers that currently prevent it from infecting living tissue. It is my sincere hope that knowledge isn't the only thing that remains lost to time. This excerpt from the archives found at Angelwood University was made possible by viewers like you. Thank you. And remember, you matter.
I gotta say too, really find it fascinating that a piece of fungus can cause all this. But that just goes to show, never underestimate, excuse me, never underestimate an organism, no matter how small it is. Because even the smallest thing can become something big like a mighty oak tree.
It seems that humanity has always been fascinated with the supernatural. We long to catch a glimpse of it, a realm just underneath our own, an anaglyph of realities. We sense that if we only had the ability to perceive them both, the true image would come into focus. But sometimes it seems the image shifts, and this supernatural realm breaches the delicate veil of our own. Sometimes the consequences are far from benevolent. On a cool night in November of 1966, a specter of unknown origin breached that very veil and descended upon the unsuspecting town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It would haunt that region for a year, a giant winged shadow, leaving witnesses with an overwhelming sense of dread and unease that persisted long after their encounters. At least, so the legends claim. Today, I will present my findings on this so-called Mothman, and rest assured the true nature of this creature is decidedly grounded in reality. And yet, as with many things I have encountered, there are shadows that the light of discovery refuses to dispel.
Mothman.
On the evening of November 15th, 1966, two young couples were driving along the outskirts of a wilderness preserve known colloquially as the TNT area when their headlights fell upon a spectral silhouette, an enormous white creature some 7 feet tall with enormous wings and glowing red eyes that instilled a hypnotic effect. Startled and deeply unsettled, the group drove away, and the creature followed. The thing shrieked overhead even as the speedometer approached 100 miles per hour. It didn't relent until at last they had pulled back into town. The group escaped their harrowing encounter, but they would not be the only ones haunted by this apparition. Over the next year, this creature was sighted numerous times in the Point Pleasant region, often accompanied by ominous occurrences. One witness caught the beast in the beam of a flashlight, describing eyes that glowed like bicycle reflectors. This witness even described disruptions in his television signal, and noted that his German Shepherd had disappeared without a trace that very night. 13 months after the first sighting of what would come to be called the Mothman on December 15, 1967, commuters were just leaving work for the day, crossing the nearby Ohio River via the Silver Bridge. Suddenly, the din of traffic was interrupted by an ear-splitting crack, almost like a gunshot. Before those crossing the river had time to even register the sound, the silver bridge folded like a deck of cards, collapsing into the water and dragging 46 souls to a watery death. Following the silver bridge tragedy, sightings of the Mothman, which had been a semi-regular occurrence to that point, dwindled to zero. Residents of Point Pleasant, reeling from the loss of friends and family, couldn't help but make a connection. Was the Mothman a herald from another realm, perhaps sent as a warning of imminent disaster? Or was it a malevolent spirit breaching a natural boundary and leaving destruction in its wake? In either case, though it seemed to disappear following that event, those affected by these sightings were plagued by a far more primal question. What will happen if the Mothman returns? There is little point in delaying my findings, my valued listener. In short, the so-called Mothman is neither supernatural nor any kind of bizarre hybrid. It is, in fact, a very large, strigiform owl, though with some admittedly unique qualities. I must also admit that the idea of the Mothman, as related in the news, at one point seemed to me nothing more than a misidentified crane or heron, blown out of proportion by sensational media coverage. In truth, I was prepared to dismiss the accounts entirely. So when my sponsor assigned the Mothman research to me, I was surprised. Nevertheless, I have encountered stranger things, and so I determined to find the truth. I arrived in the Point Pleasant region days later, accompanied by my team and with some very sensitive equipment in hand. Perhaps needless to say, it didn't take long for locals to put the pieces together, and they met us with a strange mix of emotions. Relief, perhaps to think that they weren't crazy after all, and trepidation that perhaps this phantom could actually be real. We began our search at what we determined to be the source of the initial sightings of this creature, an abandoned World War II munitions storage and manufacturing facility spread over some 8,000 acres. This area is studded with numerous earth-covered bunkers and buildings that now lie in ruin. During the day, it is little more than an interesting location, but after nightfall, when the moonlight reflects off the concrete monoliths, it's difficult to deny that a deep sense of otherworldliness blankets the region like a low-lying mist. Strangely, as we conducted a survey of the regions within this TNT area, as it is known, we came across numerous deep tire tracks, dried and nearly reclaimed by overgrowth. In the same area, we discovered cuboidal structures of rusted bars, each with doors lying ajar. An uneasy silence.
I'll be right back, my valued listeners. Until my return, listen to some wonderful jams from the tubes of you. BRB, warriors.
motherfucker will.
And we're back, my faithful viewers. Thanks for your patience as always. Just welcoming in a family member from a nice day of work. Now, though, without further ado, back to the video.
Silence fell over my companions and I upon finding these structures. They were clearly cages, though there was no evidence to indicate what they once contained. And so we returned to our work. The creature itself proved elusive for a time, but given that this presentation would have little purpose otherwise, you've likely guessed that we were eventually successful. Under the cover of night, we obtained an adult specimen and managed to perform a number of tests before our time was cut short. But while my colleagues were content to consider the mystery solved, I dare not hide the truth from you, my valued listener, and to claim that no questions remain regarding this creature would be a great disservice. What follows is a complete account of what we discovered over the course of nearly 2 months. The world of cryptozoology is fascinating, perhaps in part because even to the skeptical, they awaken our imaginations. They remind us that the world still contains its mysteries. Today, writers, video game designers, and dungeon masters create their own mysterious and fantastic worlds, each populated with creatures, people, and cultures all their own. The problem is, as these worlds grow, it can be difficult to keep track of everything. But with World Anvil, even the most complex world building is a breeze. With its robust tools, you can write up detailed accounts for each of your species, races, characters, and regions, and use the built-in autolinker function to keep track of how they relate to or descend from one another. Or you can start by importing a detailed map, and then link each of your species, races, or characters' profiles to their geographic location, making it easy to visualize your creation from a planetary view. Plus, World Anvil is always adding new features. One of their more recent features is called Chronicles, which takes some aspects of one of my favorite features, the timeline creation tool, and allows you to connect important events with their location on a map. You can even link articles such as your species or characters' profiles to these world events and their locations, which can take your creation from a dull sequence of events to a living, breathing, fully interconnected world. And once you've forged your fantasy, sci-fi, or spec evo world, all of your entries are completely searchable. Gone are the days of documents and scattered folders. With World Anvil, the only thing holding you back is your own imagination. So if you want to try out World Anvil for yourself, just visit worldanvil.com and enter code
Fascinating.
FOGPOTATO at checkout for a whopping 40% off an annual plan. So whether you're a novelist, a dungeon master planning your next campaign, or looking to create an alien planet, if you've had an idea for a world-building project and just haven't figured out where to start, check out World Anvil today and get started. Links are in the description.
You really have to love apps like this again. Like I've said earlier, you really have to love apps that allow you to create your own world, bring out your inner, bring out your inner sci-fi and fantasy ideas to life. You just really want to thank the people for putting their time into making this possible.
As I mentioned before, in reality, the Mothman has no relation to insect nor human. This was a name likely chosen for the image it invokes in the imagination, and to that end, it is very effective. But other than possessing wings and some tufts of feathers that could be mistaken for antennae at a long distance, my observations quickly led me to the true nature of this creature. Indeed, Vatisnox appalachiensis, as I have called it, should likely be placed in the strigiform order, alongside similar largely nocturnal birds of prey. I should note here that though binomial nomenclature is preferable for academic purposes, for clarity I will occasionally revert to the common vernacular. Perhaps the most notable aspect of this creature's visage is simply its size. Certainly, it dwarfs even the largest birds of prey by an order of magnitude, and though I would require a greater sample size to accurately determine average size, I can safely infer that wingspans of up to 10 feet and heights of nearly 5 feet are not uncommon. Vatisnox, as a distinct clade, likely lies outside Strigidae, the true owls, and Titanidae, the barn owls. Most likely, its lineage split from a proto-Strigid ancestor in the early to mid-Eocene. This progenitor likely bore traits similar to Sophornithidae, which lived in the Paleocene. Interestingly, the latter order were largely terrestrial, and many scientists consider them a kind of proto-owl, if you will. This lineage retained anatomical adaptations that allow it to traverse both land and sky with ease, making it extraordinarily well suited not only to its environment, but also to remaining hidden from human view seemingly at will. And so we will begin our assessment of the Appalachiensis anatomy with these very adaptations. Under the cover of night, any unfortunate soul who finds themselves wandering the Mothman's hunting ground would likely never see, much less hear, this predator approach. In the pitch blackness, Appalachiensis watches from a high perch among large branches, carefully
So you're saying it's a giant owl? Huh.
selected to conceal its silhouette. Upon locating prey, it descends airborne, silent as the grave, snatching its prey up with massive talons and stealing it away. In the eerie silence it leaves behind, all that can be heard are its victims' cries, slowly fading into the darkness. Appalachiensis achieves this silent flight through several impressive adaptations suited to its nocturnal hunting pattern. Its feathers are large, though with fewer radiates and smoother edges than other birds of prey. Its remiges, or flight feathers, in particular, display serrated edges that reduce airflow disruptions, effectively dropping sound levels to frequencies so low that its prey never hears a thing. But while its feathers are remarkably adapted,
Welcome on in. Welcome in. Name's Zach Black, the Shogun Master himself. Welcome on into the Lit Dojo. We're just reacting to some thought potato cryptid biology. Thanks. We're just looking at some Mothman biology.
to silent hunting, its wing structure exhibits far more unique anatomy. Amazingly, Appalachiensis is able to utilize its wings for arboreal and even occasionally terrestrial locomotion. This is accomplished through several adaptations. First, its second and third digits extend outward from the main body of the wing, each distal phalanx covered in a keratin sheath. These claws are similar to those found in the South American Hoatzin, but unlike these distant relatives,
Costco guys. I don't really know though. I don't really know who you're talking about. But glad to have some more commentary though. Glad to have some more people talking though. No. 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 No.
its claws persist into adulthood. Second,
Well, just this once. Alright, there you go. If she don't walk to her, you don't talk to her.
in contrast to most other modern avian species, Appalachiensis possesses greatly enlarged muscles in the pectoral girdle, including the pectoralis major and supracoracoideus. This, along with a relatively shallow and rounded glenoid fossa, allows the pectoral girdle to support its weight on the ground, as well as facilitating movement not only in the transverse plane, in a flapping motion, but also in the anterior-posterior plane, or front to back.
Okay.
Similar enhanced musculature can be found in its hind limbs as well, wherein the peroneus, flexor, and gastrocnemius muscles appear particularly hypertrophied. Third, hyperflexible bones of the wrist, including the carpometacarpus, scapulohumerales, and radial and ulnar, allow the Mothman to rotate its entire wing to allow for more articulate
So basically this thing can rotate its wings like 360 almost. So it can rotate its wings like circular. Well, I mean that's understandable, it being the arms, but when you say rotate, well, let's listen more.
grasping movements. Lastly, though I have yet to determine
The fact that it can basically grab people with its wings, that is something right there. Imagine this thing just grabbing you out of the blue during the night.
the exact mechanisms, it appears that Appalachiensis has undergone some very unique nervous system adaptations. While climbing or moving along the ground, Appalachiensis is able to move its forelimbs in cooperation with its hind limbs, with each limb moving in a traditional quadrupedal pattern. Indeed, they are able to utilize a synchronous flapping motion while in flight, while adopting an asynchronous motion on the ground or in climbing, despite the former being a deeply ingrained behavior in normal avian nervous systems. The reason for these adaptations is simple. By essentially crawling through branches and along the trunks of trees, Vatiznox appalachiensis is able to obscure its large body much more effectively, while also giving it much more maneuverability to escape detection. These traits likely arose as a response to predation, but given the size of these creatures, what predator this could be is still a mystery. In any case, these adaptations likely account not only for eyewitness reports and artistic interpretations of a humanoid being with distinct arms and legs, but could also contribute to its ability to avoid human contact for vast stretches of time. Paired with its apparent ability to intentionally hide from observers is another adaptation: its coloration. Overall, the Mothman is dark and difficult to see at all after nightfall, but a mottled cryptic plumage also serves to mimic the irregular shadows of the forests in which it dwells. While an astute observer who knows exactly what they're looking for could potentially pick Appalachiensis out of a tree line, it would be nearly impossible in even mild, low-light conditions. And the simple truth is that, like other purely nocturnal hunters, barring some extreme circumstance, this creature is never active during the day. Indeed, in my own investigation, this Mothman proved exceptionally elusive. This is partly due to the fact that, though I had thought to use imagery from the recently launched Landsat satellite to assess the creature's alleged habitat, I discovered that images of the TNT area did not align with our land-based survey. Even now, I'm unsure what might have caused this discrepancy. But of course, it seems that no creature can remain hidden from human interaction forever, and given its size, it was only a matter of time. When it has been observed, witness
That's for sure. It's only a matter of time before you get discovered. It's only a matter of time. I mean, being able to blend in at night is one thing, but during the day, that's a whole different story. That's a whole different story. So pretty much the Mothman is a giant owl apex predator. I'm so used to the term Mothman. It's like this giant moth. But now when you find out what it really is, it's like, can't even call it. There's another term for it, the owl man. So you can't really call it the Mothman, more like the owl man.
Witnesses report other strange morphological features, such as glowing red eyes. This can be explained in two ways. Contrary to the now popular belief, most eyewitnesses have not described glowing eyes as such, but rather simply that they were red. Like other nocturnal species, Vtuber appalachiensis has a specialized layer of tissue located behind the retina called tapetum lucidum. This is the cause of the characteristic eye shine found in many animal species and is likely a partial source of the Mothman's glowing description. But more specifically, appalachiensis displays a unique blood red coloration on its face, which may be a more direct source of the legendary description. This vibrant coloration is unusual in nocturnal creatures, but it may serve a purpose in sexual or confrontational displays. Now, my valued listener, if you've heard of the Mothman before this presentation, you've likely heard certain stories, like those alluded to previously. It is said that the Mothman appears as an omen just before some great tragedy. Famously, in '67, it was the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which killed 46 people. Around that time, numerous residents reported nightmares, technological disruptions, and even otherworldly visitations. Surrounding all of these, and along with the sightings, many reported a deep sense of unknowable anxiety and dread. For thousands of years, the owl has been associated with death and evil. The Hochangara of Wisconsin believe that they are messengers, harbingers of dark powers. In Mayan religion, they are emissaries from Xibalba, the place of fright. In fact, an old saying in Mexico is translated, "When the owl cries, the Indian dies." What is the source of these ominous associations? Could there be some truth to legends such as these and many more around the globe? I posit, my valued listener, that the Point Pleasant reports and perhaps even the ancient legends can be fully explained by scientific means, as represented by the mysterious Mothman. Direct behavioral observation of Vtuber appalachiensis indicates a very distinct vocalization, one that sounds in some respects like the screech common among strigidiforms. However, upon hearing the vocalization for ourselves, my team and I noted an acute emotional reaction, which we later described as unease or even dread. Presented here is a recording made late one night within the Clifton F. McClintock Wildlife Management Area, known locally as the TNT area. Using sophisticated machinery used to detect a wide spectrum of sound frequencies, I believe I have discovered the cause of the dread, nightmares, and even technological disruption described by the citizens of Point Pleasant. The call of Vtuber appalachiensis produced readings well below 20 Hz, lower than the limit of human audibility, decidedly classifying it in the range of what is known as infrasound. In the animal kingdom, frequencies this low are rarely produced, but they can be found in the lowing of the elephant elephant and the deep song of the whale. In both animals, these low-frequency calls are produced at decibel levels approaching that of a thunderclap and can travel more than 6 kilometers over land. In the water, these sounds can travel thousands. Most interestingly, however, are the effects such frequencies have on humans. It has been well documented that even a tone of 17 Hz causes feelings of unease or sorrow, producing chills down the spine or nervous feelings of revulsion or fear. Some believe that infrasound was the cause of the tragedy at Dyatlov Pass nearly 20 years ago. Furthermore, it is my belief that even certain sightings of ghosts can be attributed to infrasonic sounds, but that is a hypothesis for another time. My own examination of Appalachiensis vocal system revealed that the syrinx, the equivalent of the mammalian larynx, is greatly elongated for its body size. This alone allows this creature to produce sounds in frequencies below the threshold of human hearing and which carry for far greater distances than those in higher frequencies. Evolutionarily speaking, the reason for this ability is as yet unknown to me, but at this time I suspect that this isolated population is not alone in the Americas. In fact, if recent reports in Cornwall and Italy hold any credence, it is possible that similar species are more widespread than previously believed. If this
So it's not just one, there's multiple. Okay, so there's multiple of these doodads.
is the case, long-distance communication between such isolated populations could be necessary for the survival of this and similar species. In any case, it is clear that, as with many bird species, the location of the syrinx at the divergence of the pulmonary branches means that infrasound can be produced independently of the higher frequency vocalization. Occasionally, however, these vocalizations overlap, emitting a truly haunting song. In nature, however, infrasonic sounds are not only produced by living organisms. Sustained, low-frequency sounds commonly occur as the result of severe weather, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, lightning, and tornadoes. It is believed by many that certain animals can detect these sound waves at great distance, and many species, such as dogs and cats, have been observed fleeing shorelines hours before deadly tsunamis strike. Such sounds are also produced by man-made structures, perhaps even by unstable eye-bars in certain suspension bridges. It is my belief that Vatisnox appalachiensis is drawn to disasters like a duck is drawn to a hunter's call. To some observers, this behavior makes it appear as a harbinger of doom, its red eyes and dark silhouette completing a truly haunting visage. Even to those who have not seen the creature, its call elicits a deep sense of foreboding in the human psyche, causing nightmares, fear, and even brief hallucinations. This call produces a sound inaudible to us, and yet somehow we hear it, deep within ourselves. Drawn out of its normal hiding places, it is likely that Appalachiensis took this opportunity to hunt, as the local owner of a German Shepherd sadly discovered. But now, my valued listener, I must beg your indulgence once more, for up to this point, we've discussed the biological systems of a creature that, for the greater part, bears some resemblance to animals with which we're familiar. I was fortunate enough, however, to observe this creature in its natural habitat. Upon close examination, its methods of locomotion, its vocalizations, its appearance, and even its alleged ethereal qualities are relatively easily explained. Still, it is the creature's size that gives me pause. Certainly, raptors of great size have been catalogued. Blakiston's fish owl, for example, can reach wingspans of nearly 7 feet, and the Eurasian eagle owl stands up to 30 inches tall. Neither of these, however, can equal the monstrous 10-foot wingspan of Appalachiensis, nor its standing height of nearly 5 feet. Despite its cryptic coloration and impressively stealthful behavior, it would be difficult for a creature of this size to go undocumented for so long. It is possible that the Mothman grew to such a size in response to environmental pressures, such as competition from other raptors, which may have forced it to...
That is possible when you give it the thought. Some birds can grow up to unprecedented sizes depending on their environmental impacts and influence upon them.
Seek larger prey, thus increasing its size accordingly. And certainly, the mountains of Appalachia conceal countless secrets. But I cannot shake the feeling that something occurred in this region just before those now famous 13 months. I have yet to ascertain what this might be, but I have rarely found my hunches to be wrong. Still, if this is the first time, I will feel nothing but relief. I have documented a great many previously undiscovered creatures, and I am honored to be at the forefront of this important research. But while legends often speak of these creatures as physical threats to humans, the Mothman is unique. Though it instills fear, rarely is it perceived as a vicious killer. Instead, it is an omen, a harbinger from another dimension. It is what Horsley calls an emissary from the id, a manifestation of Point Pleasant's collective unconscious. In short, the Mothman isn't frightening because it preys on human flesh. Rather, it seems to prey on the mind. Though the creature itself is biological corporeality, for humans it represents not a physical threat, but a threat to reason. Indeed, it is my fear that the Mothman represents not only those aspects of the world we don't yet know, or can never know, but in fact those that we are not allowed to know.
Well said, my friend. Well said. Let me see, where was it now?
The ancient and medieval world was filled with the unknown, and for many who lived in these eras, the unknown was a source of fear. The edges
So whenever I think of the Mothman, it's basically just a giant owl that's misunderstood. Just a misunderstood owl boy. Okay, cool. Cool.
of maritime maps warned of hulking monsters waiting to devour any who would sail beyond their ordained territory, while the most exotic places on the planet were said to be the home of frightening, malformed beasts, humanoid creatures with their faces in their torsos, or who shaded themselves with a single enormous foot. But at the time, perhaps the most well-known of all these bizarre beings were the cynocephali, a race of dog-headed people who lived well outside the realms of civilized society. In those past ages, these canine hominids weren't mythical. They were a virtual certainty, so much so that questions of their intrinsic humanity was debated among scholars and church fathers alike. But just who were the cynocephali? Were they a myth dreamed up by oral tradition? Why do legends of similar dog-human hybrids appear throughout different ages and cultures? Or is it possible that such a people actually existed? Settle in, dear traveler, because the answers to those questions will take us on a journey across continents and through time. One of the earliest accounts of the cynocephaly dates back to around 400 BC. In Indica, Greek physician Ctesias describes the wondrous land now known as India, where trees grew to staggering heights, elephants roamed the jungles, and a race of dog-headed people inhabited the lofty and inaccessible mountains. They speak no language but bark like dogs, and in this manner make themselves understood by each other. They understand the Indian language but are unable to converse, only barking or making signs with their hands and fingers by way of reply. They live on raw meat. Ctesias goes on to say that these strange people are agile and efficient hunters, though they also breed livestock and have established trade routes with the king of India. But although they were clearly intelligent creatures, Ctesias notes that they preferred to live in caves and sleep on the ground, as opposed to the idealized version of society the Greeks were used to. Perhaps most remarkably, Ctesias claims that they are just and live longer than any other men, 170, sometimes 200 years. At a time when the average life expectancy was around 40 years old, this was a very long lifespan. Centuries later, the famous explorer Marco Polo described a similar people, this time localized to the Andaman Islands. But unlike Ctesias' description, these cynocephali were far more vicious and barbaric. The people are without a king and idolaters, and no better than wild beasts. And I assure you, all the men of this island of Angamanan have heads like dogs, and teeth and eyes likewise. In fact, in the face they are all just like big mastiff dogs. They have a quantity of spices, but they are a most cruel generation, and eat everybody that they can catch, if not their own race. They live on flesh and rice and milk, and have fruits different from any of ours. Of course, the infamous John Mandeville also published an account of the cynocephaly in his Travels, which circulated in the mid to late 1300s. This account is more similar to Ctesias in that the cynocephaly are described as intelligent and reasonable, even devout, with the only odd characteristic being that they tend to eat their prisoners of war. After that isle go men by the sea ocean, by many isles, unto an isle that is clept Nakumera, that is a great...
I guess you could say it's a man-eat-man world. So basically these guys are intelligent, but they just can't they can understand the Indian language, but they can't speak it because they only can speak canine, which is somewhat understandable as we further understand.
Great isle and good and fair, and all the men and women of that isle have hounds' heads, and they be clept cynocephales, and they be full reasonable and of good understanding, save that they worship an ox for their god, and also every one of them beareth an ox of gold or silver in his forehead, in token that they love well their god. They be great folk and well fighting, and if they take any man in battle, anon they eat him. The cynocephali remained in the public consciousness for centuries, though their location seemed less than concrete. While Theseus placed a very large dog-headed population high in the mountains of India, Marco Polo and Mandeville placed them in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, an archipelago far off India's eastern coastline. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, a famous and sprawling map of the known world circa 1300, assigns the cynocephaly much closer to Europe. The cynocephaly would make another appearance on the Piri Reis map of 1513, which was reportedly based on maps made by Columbus. This time, the cynocephaly are depicted on the northern coast of South America, though by this time the dog-headed people of legend had come to be associated with the anthropophagi, or cannibals, that were actually found in the Caribbean. Ultimately, though, these juxtapositions of man and beast were not limited by location, culture, or even humanity. Now we'll take a step back to examine the dog-headed people as a whole, from their role in divinity to the absolute essence of what makes us human. Thousands
Gods
of
and
years before
beasts.
Theseus, beings with the bodies of men and the heads of canines were not unheard of. For the ancient Egyptians, Anubis was the protector of graves, the lord of the underworld, and the god who ushered souls into the afterlife. Most often he was depicted as a man with the head of a dark-haired jackal or wolf.
Anubis.
This
Well, at least he's not a noob in this.
black coloration represented the soil of the Nile River, Egypt's source of life, as well as the color of embalmed bodies, which simultaneously symbolized death of the body and the beginning of the afterlife. The Egyptian culture placed enormous significance on symbolism, and the fact that Anubis was represented with the head of a jackal is no coincidence. Jackals patrolled the Egyptian cemeteries, stealing in under cover of night to raid their shallow graves and feast on the bodies buried there. These wild dogs also lived on the outskirts of Egyptian cities and were a constant source of trouble. As god of the dead, Anubis' canine appearance allowed him to ward off members of his own kind as he transported souls to the afterlife. In short, the dog-headed god was a way to fight fire with fire. For the Egyptian people, Anubis' seemingly opposing aspects, animalism and deity, chaos and order, combined to form a kind of balance. And for the god who weighed the scale of your life, this balance was a comfort. A few thousand years later, the same aspects that expressed balance in the Egyptian god of the underworld came to be seen as a treacherous dichotomy between who mankind was and who he desired to be. 4th century theologian and philosopher Augustine of Hippo devoted much thought to the cynocephaly, and particularly whether they were merely animals without a soul or beings with a rational mind and as deserving of salvation as any other man. What shall I say of the cynocephaly, whose dog-like head and barking proclaim them beasts rather than men? For God, the creator of all, knows where and when each thing ought to be, or to have been created, because he sees the similarities and diversities which can contribute to the beauty of the whole. But he who cannot see the whole is offended by the deformity of the part, because he is blind to that which balances it, and to which it belongs. For Augustine, the essential humanity of the cynocephaly was important. Those who argue that humanity is based on appearance or the ability to speak miss the point entirely. Instead, it was rationality that separated man from beast, and as a rational
That's true. Through a philosopher, what separates man from beast is no doubt intellect, rationality, and morale. I mean, being able to reason and to understand pretty much says the big difference compared to beast.
people, the cynocephaly were as much a part of the human family as those born with deformities. As therefore no one will deny that these are all descended from that one man, so all the races which are reported to have diverged in bodily appearance from the usual course which nature generally or almost universally preserves, if they are embraced in that definition of man as rational and mortal animals, unquestionably trace their pedigree to that one first father of all. 100 years later, the other side of that argument was taken up by Saint Isidore of Seville. He wrote that the cynocephaly's method of communication, barking, reveals them to be more beasts than men. The 8th century Liber Monstrorum, a catalogue of wondrous creatures, takes this a step further, saying that the cynocephaly actually pervert language by barking. Both Isidore and the author of Liber Monstrorum take a clear stance. Language is what separates human from inhuman. For great minds like Isidore and Augustine, the cynocephaly were worth considering, partly because of the very real possibility that they actually existed. By most accounts, they had a functioning society, even an important role in their respective kingdoms. And as to the question of their ability to receive salvation, well, the appearance of a certain dog-headed saint may provide the answer. According to medieval legend, only a couple of hundred years after the death of Christ, a man named Reprobus was born in a land called Canaan. Besides being barbarous and generally unpleasant, he was also a giant, between 7 and 12 feet tall depending on the source. Because of his imposing size, Reprobus sought only to serve the mightiest person on earth. For a time, he thought that person to be the Canaanite king, but when he saw his king make the sign of the cross whenever someone mentioned the devil, he realized that Satan must be the most powerful being on earth. He sought out the devil and served him for a time, but as Reprobus and his new master passed near a cross on the side of the road, he saw that the devil was terrified of it. The devil told him that the sign of Christ filled him with fear. Reprobus knew he had to seek out this Christ, who could make even the devil cower in fear. He came across a hermit who taught him all about this most powerful God. In an effort to enter Christ's good graces, the hermit recommended that Reprobus utilize his immense size to carry people across a dangerous local river, where many died in crossing. One day, as he was doing this, a small child asked Reprobus to ferry him across. He hoisted the boy onto his shoulders and began to cross. As he did, the child grew heavier and heavier until even he was in danger of drowning. "O child," he cried, "how heavy thou art! It seems I bear the weight of the world on my shoulder." And the child replied, "Right thou art. Thou bearest not only the world, but the Creator of heaven and earth. I am Jesus Christ, thy King and Lord, and henceforth thou shalt be called Christophorus, that is, Christ-bearer." Reprobus,
Aw.
now known as Christopher, would go on to convert entire cities for the Lord's cause before being martyred sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries.
Oh.
It's an intriguing tale, to be sure, but why mention him here? Well, the earliest portraits of the patron saint of travelers depict him not only as a giant, but as a human with the head of a dog. Yes, in early church tradition, Saint Christopher was a cynocephaly. Virtually all of what we know about Saint Christopher stems from accounts written in the Middle Ages, the same period of time when documents by Polo and Mandeville presented their descriptions of dog-headed men at the edges of the world. The Irish Passion of St. Christopher, a 15th century biography of sorts, describes the saint as retaining his feral appearance well after his conversion. There was a persecution of Christians in time of the Emperor Decius, and the holy man Christopher was taken and tortured like the others. Christopher was exceedingly
Well,
wise.
see, I kind of like that concept. So basically, despite his appearance, he was still willing to do the right thing. Well, see, that's all that matters. That's all that matters. You find the right people who lead you down the right path. The people who want to convert you to do the right thing. That's all that matters. I mean, yeah, he was killed at the end, but at least he died a good man. A good man who was literally carrying Christ on his shoulders. Well, he went out the true way. He went out the honorable way, if you ask me.
And had observed that the Lord assisted those of the heathen who believed just as much as he assisted Christians. Now this Christopher was one of the dogheads, a race that had the heads of dogs and ate human flesh. He meditated much on God, but at that time he could only speak the language of the dogheads. When he saw how much the Christians suffered, he was indignant and left the city. He began to adore God and prayed. "Almighty God," he said, "give me the gift of speech. Open my mouth and make plain thy might, that those who persecute thy people may be converted." Here again, the ability to speak seems to be the crux of both humanity and rationality. And similar to cynocephaly in the distant lands of India, St. Christopher originally hailed from the distant and heathen land of Canaan. Though the church no longer incorporates the cynocephalic iconography that was popular in the Middle Ages, there has been much speculation as to why St. Christopher was depicted with the head of a dog in the first place. Some say that it's a simple translation error. The word Canaan, even in the original Greek, sounds a lot like canine after all. Others say that this imagery is a kind of spiritual successor to Anubis, the god of the underworld infiltrating Christianity. Of course, the simplest explanation is that Reprobus was actually part of a race of dog-headed men whose countenance was miraculously transformed to match his kind heart. However it began, or whatever truth can actually be found there, the legend of St. Christopher serves a purpose that transcends simple translation errors or artistic liberties. It provides a glimpse into the medieval mind. With similar imagery appearing in texts and descriptions dating back millennia, why were these legends of dog-headed people so pervasive? The answer could be a case of mistaken identity in more ways than one. The reasons for the cynocephalies' appearance in so much of medieval literature has been the source of much academic debate. The fact is that early explorers tended to infuse their tales of exotic lands with whimsical descriptions. Rather than a cotton plant, for example, John Mandeville described a plant that grew tiny living sheep. For modern scholars, the only question is how to find the grain of truth in these larger-than-life accounts. One possible explanation for the dog-headed men has been around since at least the 13th century, when Albert the Great, in a description of baboons, noted that they are those who are called the dogmen in the Mappamundi. It's certainly conceivable that the appearance of certain primates, like the baboon, could be interpreted as a dog-like face with a humanoid body. But while the people of ancient and pre-modern times were certainly known to be superstitious, they were also known to be fearful and mistrustful of those they considered to be outsiders. Many modern historians believe that the cynocephali were a manifestation of this fear. The animal nature of these monsters were extreme personifications of those who lived outside of civilized society. Interestingly, the evolution of the medieval sentiment toward outsiders can be observed in the illustrations of cynocephaly that appeared throughout that time period. Early 15th century illustrations of travels by Mandeville, for example, depicted the cynocephaly as civilized, often with armor or clothing, engaging in conversation, establishing agriculture, and even dwelling in colorful cities. But as the century progressed, the depictions of cynocephaly began to change. Instead of maintaining a civilized society, they were now animalistic cannibals, shown attacking and eating noble human victims. It's likely no coincidence that this shift in tone coincided with Columbus's expeditions in the late 15th century. The known world was expanding, and as the edges of the map pressed outward, the domain of the monsters was diminishing. Now, it wasn't India or Canaan that contained the most barbarous of all races, it was the Caribbean. Columbus expected to find monsters there, but upon his first voyage, he was met with only normal human beings. When Columbus also didn't find the vast wealth of riches he had promised his financiers back in Spain, he set his mind on a different source of wealth: people. The crown, however, was not willing to endorse the large-scale enslavement of the natives, and so outright forbade it. But on Columbus's second voyage to the Caribbean in 1494, he encountered what he considered to be much more in line with the monsters he expected. He found actual man-eaters, tribes of anthropophagy, or cannibals. Because of their abhorrent habit of eating human flesh, Columbus was able to justify their exportation and extermination. Eventually, the crown would even institute the so-called cannibal law, which, in contrast to the freedom granted to other native people,
Yeah, typical. This is one of the reasons why we don't celebrate Christopher Columbus Day. That's one reason why we don't. There's plenty of others. So basically, you took over their land, took their crown, and what? To prove some bias point? Whoop-de-doo, don't you feel special?
allowed for the enslavement and subjugation solely of cannibals. Sadly, it could be argued that this precedent contributed to the complete extinction of even the peaceful Taino people, largely due to enslavement, mistreatment, widespread murders, and disease given to them by their European overlords. For many people of the time, the cannibal tribes were the real-life equivalent of the cynocephaly, a people so bestial, vicious, and uncivilized that they could not truly be classified as human. Of course, many other people felt the opposite way, that no matter how inhuman one's outward appearance may be, the ability to think and reason is enough to deem them worthy of acceptance. After all, even dog-headed people contribute, as Augustine put it, to the beauty of the whole. The question of whether or not the cynocephaly actually existed ultimately doesn't matter much. Either way, their role in history is just as significant. Combined into one body, they represent both the best and worst of humanity: nobility and carnality, peace and violence, even sinner and saint. Eventually, the dog-headed men began to disappear from the public consciousness altogether. Like the Skyopods and Blemye and other monsters of the time, they simply lost their place in the world. But we can still learn from them even today. After all, as Sam Ottawell Soulsby writes in the Journal of Urban History, to read a description of the cynocephaly is to read an argument about what it means to be human. For more medieval monsters, be sure to check out this video, and a huge shout out to my patrons, it is much appreciated.
Well said, my friend. Very well said. Especially what it means to be human. That's something a lot of people don't take into accountability or don't even want to think about nowadays. Just trying to find the last video for tonight. But as we were talking though, yeah, so what it means to be human, trying to justify mainly rationality through thought, language, culture, society. I mean, it's kind of biased in some sense, but also true. Trying to understand what we can identify as human. Me personally, I would just go with morale, your honor, your sense of morale and honor, just your justice. Understanding how you think and how you would perceive doing the right thing.
Hello and welcome. Man, it is good to see you again. Now, as you may have noticed, speculative evolution, speculative zoology, or just spec evo, as I like to call it, is it's been taken off lately, and I don't know if you've noticed that, but it's with a good reason. And it's a unique niche that involves a lot of artwork and scientific conjecture. And the big player right now is, of course, All Tomorrows by C.M. Kozman, but as it turns out, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Now, if you aren't familiar with the concept of an iceberg, it's basically this. If there's a topic that can be divided up into different categories, it can be an iceberg. So at the top of the iceberg, you have the information that most people know. The middle, which is usually a middle tier or a few, this is the information that some fans would know, somebody who's interested in the topic. And then deep, deep under the water, where most of the iceberg is usually the obscure information reserved only for the hardcore fans. And this iceberg image was obtained from a subreddit called Speculative Evolution, which is only fitting, and a user named PesterJest, who I will link to in the description, made it. So here's the thing. The mysterious world of Spec Evo involves a lot of, as you might have guessed, speculation, and because of that, it often drifts into the realm of world building, as it's called, which is the process of inventing a whole new world from things like the ecology, physics, flora, fauna, earth science, culture, everything that might be part of a world that we're just inventing, basically. A lot of times it's used for the process of writing novels, especially like fantasy novels where you're inventing whole systems of like magic and culture, or maybe the world of a video game might apply as well. Most recently, like in the video by Wendigoon called The Mystery Flesh Pit National Park, which he didn't make up, but he covered, is fascinating little bit of world building. So, of course, the idea of making up an entire world is where the Venn diagrams of speculative evolution and world building intersect. And so with that out of the way, let's just jump in to tier 1 or level 1 of this iceberg. And we begin on the little place called Skull Island from the Kong universe. Way back in 2005, when the one true King Kong movie was released, there was a book released by Weta Digital who did the visual art for it, the visual effects, if you will. And this book, I could not be more impressed.
I remember this version of King Kong. Also fairly fascinating with like the animals, the creatures, the forest, just the flora. Especially the giant insect part. That also fascinated me a little bit. Creeped me out too, but also fascinated me nonetheless.
With the work that the artist put into these designs, not only do you get the artwork, but they went to all the trouble of incorporating descriptions, binomial nomenclature, behaviors, and it's like a field guide for these fictional animals. It's amazing. Of course, there have been other Kong movies, I will acknowledge, which include their own form of speculative zoology, but one thing's for sure, everything on Skull Island wants you dead, and it wants to be the one that kills you. From the freaky insects to the dinosaurs to the pteranodon, which is from a deleted scene I found on YouTube, and that's from the 2005 movie. It's very disturbing, as are most scenes, honestly, on Skull Island from that movie. And the more recent Skull Crawlers, which you may have seen in 2017's Kong Skull Island. If you visit Skull Island, let's just say you're going to have a bad time. That's clear. I saw the Peter Jackson King Kong when I was much younger, and the scene with the insects in the pit, the worms, if you've seen it, you know the exact one I'm talking about, disturbed me for life. Anyways, it's still
You and I both, partner. You and I both.
super interesting to think about how all these different species would adapt to such fierce competition. Obviously, if everything wants to kill you and to be the one that kills you, there's a lot of competition amongst these predators. And it seems for every herbivore that there is, there's like 2 or 3 carnivores designed to hunt it. Kind of seems like every predator fills a certain niche. In the mud, you have worms. In the swamps, you have the pteranodons I mentioned. In the plains, you have theropod dinosaurs. And the forests have all kinds of crap. It's basically like real life, but on steroids. So you can't really get that book that I mentioned by Weta Digital with all the stunning illustrations and information because it's out of print, and unless you want to pay a ton of money on eBay, just check out the wiki, which I will leave a link to in the description. Next, we have what's known as the Fermi paradox, and that is basically this. If the universe is so big and so old, where are all the aliens? Mr. Fermi himself famously asked this question around the year 1950, and it's been known since then as the Fermi paradox, which any sentence that has the word paradox in it is cool, in my opinion. So to answer that question, where are all the aliens? A recent study found that there's only about a 50% chance that any aliens are out there, and so as a result, there's a 50% chance that we're completely alone in the universe. But honestly, who the heck knows? Nobody does. Now, not to get too far into the weeds here, but the Fermi paradox is heavily associated with what's known as the Drake equation, which uses a product of 7 factors to estimate the number of extraterrestrial civilizations in our galaxy. So I'm not a mathematician. To say that is a huge understatement, but I'm going to try to knock it out here. So these 7 factors basically are, first, they're starting broad, like what are the odds of this? And if the odds of that are happening, then what are the odds of this happening? And so it really just moves down the list of more specificity. But it starts with the rate of star formation. That's the first factor. What is the rate of star formation in the Milky Way? And that's the only one we know with any accuracy. And we know that it's about 7 stars per year are formed. Next is the fraction of those stars which have a planetary system, which again is tough to say, but there's a range of about 20 to 60%, though it could be much higher. The next part of the equation is what is the average number of those planets that are able to support life? Again, very hard to say how likely that is, especially if you believe in the rare Earth hypothesis, which states that the occurrence of life is just extraordinarily unlikely. Apparently, the rare Earth hypothesis takes no account for alternative biology.
Many of the whole equations to analyze the possibility of aliens. Fascinating. I'll have to look that up after stream too. Post on my Twitter. I mean, to say that there is no other life outside of our own galaxy, one cannot fully say or truly rely on that, because you never know. There could be other life beyond our reach. And maybe for the time it's best we don't reach that point just yet. Because we're too immature to talk to aliens, that's for sure.
But still, Drake himself in the equation used a value of 2 for this factor, but it could be much lower than that. And next we have what is the fraction of those Earth-like planets where life actually appears? So yeah, if other life-supporting planets exist, what are the odds that it would actually have life on it? Some smart people, scientists, have suggested that life is inevitable if a planet is able to support it. So, who knows? But if the idea of panspermia is true, then the likelihood of those habitable planets actually having life is much higher. And we'll talk more about panspermia coming up. Next, we have what are the fraction of those life-bearing planets that have intelligent life? This is completely unknown, but again, many smart people believe that intelligent life is inevitable given enough time. However, it's also likely that most life would go extinct before reaching intelligence, so that's another thing to throw in there. And this, of course, does not account for that. Next, what is the fraction of those intelligent species that are also able to communicate at an interstellar level, which is much harder than you would think? There's just no way to know how likely that is. And so, since a species could be wiped out early, or perhaps they just have no desire to develop technology. The idea of an alien civilization having the ability to communicate but not wanting to develop technology to do so is kind of interesting. In All Tomorrows, you had the bug facers who did not want to take part in communications outside their planet because they were afraid it would invite an alien attack. And then in Man After Man, you have the memory people who could remember the fact that humans once developed technology and had nothing to do with it because of the disaster that it brought upon them. So that's kind of interesting, making the connection there. Anyways, but what if they developed a more efficient method of communication that we just couldn't pick up on? So there's, you just don't know. And then finally, you have the time span in which a civilization is around and able to communicate. On Earth, some scientists estimate that the average lifespan of a species is between 2 and 4 million years. And that would be just a small blip for a more advanced civilization. Now you need to solve for n, and so using these estimates, how many likely civilizations are there in our galaxy, or just anywhere, I guess, really? I don't know, but it's probably between 1,000 and 100 million.
Imagine going through all that just to understand. I personally couldn't. It would take me some time to understand. I'd have to read a book on this furthermore. I'd really have to read a book. Let's go ahead and end the stream on another simpler video. There it is.
Though historical accounts of the siren are inconsistent to say the least, there exists a grain of truth in nearly every myth. Indeed, there are several attributes described by numerous historians and writers that are, by my own observations, rooted in reality. These can be broken down as follows. First, luring human prey through vocalization. As Pliny the Elder said, they charm men by their song, and having first lulled them to sleep, tear them to pieces. Second, the apparent amalgamation of human and beast. As I will prove, this is arguably the most disturbing aspect of these creatures' physiology. Third, a population in the Mediterranean Sea, or perhaps more specifically, the Tyrrhenian Sea. Though siren or mermaid sightings have been reported worldwide, they appear to have originated in this part of the world. Though I realize it sounds fantastic, I ask you to suspend your disbelief for our time together. The truth is that Sirenus horridus, as I have dubbed this disturbing creature, is almost nothing like what I had in mind before that fateful
Good name. Good scientific name indeed.
trip to the
Since she likes to hoard men.
Mediterranean, and biologically speaking, it is one of the greatest examples of environmental adaptation to have ever existed. Throughout history, the siren entered humanity's awareness through extraordinarily narrow windows, glimpses of a tail beneath the water's surface, a haunting call in the distance, a human-like hand reaching up from the depths. And still, this species took up residence in humanity's subconscious, and its legend took on a life of its own. As evidenced by modern artwork, media, and countless stories, the image of the siren refuses to fade. But now, my valued listener, I will present to you the true image of this creature. Do not let its disturbing visage distract you. As I mentioned previously, Sirenus horridus is a wonder of nature, and as I will show, a distorted reflection of ourselves. It is my belief that Sirenus horridus was once relatively
Well, scrap. Good luck sleeping well tonight.
common throughout the Mediterranean, its range stretching from the Alboran Sea to the Levantine and north to the Tyrrhenian and Aegean. Relatively isolated from the rest of the Atlantic by the Strait of Gibraltar, the deep waters of the Mediterranean basin provided adequate resources for this species to thrive. Specifically, ancient sightings of sirens placed them on the Sirenum Scopuli, a chain of 3 small, rocky islands. English essayist Joseph Addison described these islands as about a stone's throw from the south side of the island of Capri, but others indicate that they were located in the Tyrrhenian Sea instead. In any case, the ocean's depth, up to 17,280 feet in the Calypso Deep, allows the siren to escape human view when necessary, and individuals may go their entire life without being detected by a human, at least by ones that survive to tell the tale. I hypothesize that this species spends most of its time within the mesopelagic zone, typically ascending the water column only to hunt. This not only allows the siren to remain undetected, but it also reduces competition from a similar, though completely unrelated creature, the mermaid, which spends most of its time in the epipelagic zone. Additionally, this sees
Oh, so sirens and mermaids are two different things. Okay. Okay, I thought they were the same thing.
high salinity and warm average temperatures facilitated the siren's growth. Indeed, adults can reach lengths of up to 7 feet and weigh upwards of 200 pounds. Though we will explore this biology further, in short, it is my recommendation that Sirenus horridus be classified in the clade Sarcopterygiae, a taxon that includes lobe-finned fish such as coelacanths, lungfish, and, under a strictly cladistic view, also includes tetrapods, including humans. The reason for this classification is that sirens appear to have inherited a number of traits shared with other bony fishes. Their entire body is covered in scaloid scales composed of bone and cosmine and covered in keratin, though compared to their relatives, these scales are small and very thin, making them appear almost smooth, especially from a distance. The posterior of their bodies terminates in a powerful, dificercal caudal fin supported by a surprising amount of highly vascularized red muscle, making it capable of extraordinary bursts of speed, especially when hunting in the depths. Of course, sirens are able to breathe underwater, utilizing gills located at the base of their necks and just anterior of the pectoral girdle, but they also possess rudimentary lungs, as seen in the order Dipnoi, a point to which we will return in due time. Like their ancestors, sirens appear to be ectothermic, relying on their environment to maintain their body temperature. However, I have observed that the gill arches contain a dense network of blood vessels, likely capable of producing heat and allowing the siren to withstand a greater range of colder temperatures than
I mean, they can regulate their temperature like some fish do, depending on the seasonal change.
their less derived relatives. Even still, the lack of true endothermy has restricted their impressive speed to short bursts and has not bestowed the siren lineage with great intelligence. Indeed, this species appears to act on instinct and mimicry rather than true cunning or planning. Depending on your perspective, this is either a relief or even more terrifying. My own observations were limited to a single female specimen, so I cannot say whether this species exhibits notable sexual dimorphism, but given the lack of obvious external primary or secondary sexual characteristics, I believe the genders will prove very similar in overall appearance. But besides the anatomy of these creatures, perhaps the most unnerving aspect of their biology has to do with their diet. Though they are opportunistic omnivores feeding on a mix of smaller fish, crustaceans, snails, and more, with sharp, backward-facing dentition, powerful jaw muscles, grasping limbs, and features specifically designed to lure hominids, in the modern era, Sirenus horridus's preferred prey items are humans. In eons past, our
scrap.
sea-dwelling ancestors turned their collective gaze to the land. As evidenced by creatures like Tiktaalik, fin became limb, and primitive pectoral bones became the shoulder girdle. Since that time, formerly land-based lineages have even returned to the water. Such was the case for Ambulocetus, the semi-aquatic creature whose very name translates to walking whale. Indeed, history is filled with examples of creatures of many different varieties, moving from water to land and from land to water, usually due to specific environmental pressures. It is my hypothesis that something, perhaps a lack of resources, a climate imbalance, or even competition from a similar creature in its niche, forced the ancestors of Sirenus horridus to venture out of the deep waters of the Mediterranean and into the shallows of the coastline. It was here that this lineage found a new home. Resources were abundant, and over vast stretches of time, much like present-day mudskippers, numerous adaptations allowed them to prop themselves up, crawling over dry rocks and even onto the shore itself for short periods of time. Long-standing scientific studies indicate that at some point in the distant past, a basal bony fish, perhaps a species similar to the Silurian-era Gyuoneiros, gave rise to ray-finned fishes, lobe-finned fishes, and eventually tetrapoda. The ancestors of the siren likely underwent a similar trajectory.
So basically, evolution from sea to land and to land to sea again. That is a constant, never-ending change between species, to be honest. It's like you think they would pick a lane, but they never do. It's like they just can't pick a lane.
venturing out of the sea and onto coastlines throughout the Mediterranean. Besides its head, a point to which we will return shortly, what sets Sirenus horridus apart from other fish are its distinctly human-like forelimbs, and indeed, rather than lobed fins, these appendages are very similar to those belonging to land-dwelling tetrapods. Sarcopterygians are the perfect lineage to produce such a surprising body plan, and for numerous reasons. Fossils from genuses such as Panderichthys and Tiktaalik, both of which are descended from more basal lobe-finned fishes, exhibit well-developed limbs. Specifically, in Panderichthys, we see limbs placed more forward and located at a right angle to the body, as opposed to being more oriented toward the posterior. Muscles adapted as well, allowing for a greater range of motion, and eventually affecting further development of crucial bones within. For example, the humerus of both Panderichthys and Tiktaalik are considered transitional because they are almost L-shaped, a feature which early tetrapods would refine further. They also exhibit a low latissimus dorsi process, a low entepicondyle, and an intermediate entepicondylar canal. In short, due to the orientation of the forefin toward the posterior region, the muscles were able to act at a right angle to the body, giving Panderichthys the ability to very effectively prop itself up. Similar adaptations have granted Sirenus horridus the ability to pull itself onto the shore, but this highly adaptable lineage has taken it multiple steps further. First, there is the robust rib cage, a key trait of land-living creatures. This helps support the trunk and has allowed Sirenus to develop somewhat advanced lungs, but we will return to that point in a moment. Second are the presence of greatly elongated fin rays, very similar to the digits of human hands. There are no opposable digits, however, and articulation capability is likely limited to swimming and sweeping, grabbing gestures. And of course, pulling its heavy posterior region across the rocky land. The bones of the upper limbs could be compared to the ulnar and intermedium of true tetrapods, with a robust shoulder, including expanded scapular and coracoid elements. The distal joints also appear to be highly mobile, able to flex, move, and likely fully support the weight of the upper body. Third, and perhaps most notably, much like Tiktaalik, the ancestors of Sirenus horridus lost the bony plates in the gill area that would have restricted lateral head movement. As a result, modern sirens have a kind of neck, separating the pectoral girdle from the skull and giving these creatures a mighty advantage when hunting.
Meaning their necks are more larger and more lengthened from their shoulders. Their upper body carries more body strength, being able to carry and drag their body onto the surface. Probably from previous times before they evolved into what they are now. Before they became water dwellers, they were land dwellers. Perhaps they still regained some of their muscular strength from land.
On land. Unlike the examples used here, however, sirens appear to exhibit negligible development of the rear limbs, perhaps in part due to the competition with which they were met from the land. We'll return to this point shortly as well. Of course, as the siren's ancestors moved into the shallow intertidal zones, there came an increasing need for a more specialized respiratory system. The adaptations that would solve this problem also facilitated these creatures' most notorious trait, their song. At some point in the early Devonian, a progenitor of the siren found itself stranded in a shallow, likely intertidal pool, with oxygenated water slowly depleting. Fortunately for this individual, it possessed a genetic mutation that had produced a hole in the gill membrane, which led into the swim bladder through the mouth. The swim bladder itself was thin enough to allow oxygen to diffuse through it, and in effect, it acted as a primitive lung. Because of this mutation, this individual survived, and eventually, through a series of other changes, and at the risk of sounding reductive, the siren was born. This has happened in other areas of nature, and specifically for what I suspect to be a not too distantly related lineage. All extant lungfish also exhibit extraordinarily unique respiratory systems. Indeed, not only do they possess lungs derived from specialized, subdivided gas bladders, but some also retain the gills that allow them to breathe in water. The same is true of Sirenus. Eventually, in order to prevent drowning upon returning to the water, a valve appeared in the throat which guarded the entrance to that pulmonary outgrowth. This valve would eventually become the larynx, a structure that essentially sits within the windpipe, closing it off when necessary. In many animals, these flaps of flesh can vibrate when air is passed through them, creating sound. Of course, in many animals, these are also called vocal cords. But first-hand observations via dissection indicate that sirens possess a startlingly advanced vocal apparatus and can produce vocalizations beyond those of which even humans are capable. In fact, the entire apparatus, which I hesitate to call a larynx at all, extends distally to the base of the trachea, at the point where it forks into the two pulmonary branches. Here, the structure appears strikingly similar to the membrana tympaniformis and pessulus of the avian syrinx. Though the specimen I observed in detail was expired, it seems likely that as the lungs contract, unique throat muscles modulate the sound shape by changing the tension of the membranes and the bronchial openings in a manner bizarrely similar to birds. In short, this advanced vocal anatomy allows the siren to produce a multitude of sound. In fact, the lower part of this voice structure's position between the two pulmonary branches may allow it to produce two sounds at once. Not
In other words, their vocal cords started to adapt more to the point where they could mimic human sounds too. They could possibly have human speech due to evolution over time with their vocal cords. Understandable. Brings you back to when we were in middle school, how we used to talk about mermaids. Understand the possibility of their existence. Well, for one fact, they're not as beautiful as Disney depicts it. That is for sure. They're not as beautiful as Disney depicts, but, well, that's just the reality of it. Fantasy in the real world is not the same as its animation counterparts.
Not only could this ability account for the siren's legendary song, but it may also explain the ancient association of the siren with the body of a bird. In any case, certain sustained vocalizations could undoubtedly be alluring, and biologically speaking, that is precisely the point. I present to you now for the first time a fragment of Sirenus horridus's terrible vocalizations, personally recorded one dark night as I rowed a small boat seaward from the coast of Italy. Be warned, however, though this sound serves a purpose, it is deeply unnerving. This, dear listener, is a form of mimicry designed to elicit an empathetic response in humans. Had I not known what was truly producing the sound, even I may have been taken in by the entirely irrational assumption that a child was stranded on a spit of land somewhere in the endless ocean. Indeed, Sirenus horridus is a master of mimicry. Throughout history, there is little doubt that it would mimic the sound of a call for help, or perhaps even a chorus picked up from passing sailors. Intrigued by the sound, sailors would turn from their course, close enough to land to allow the sirens to hunt and drag their victims onto the shoreline for further consumption. But a vocalization alone would likely not be enough to fool every sailor, especially when they drew close enough to see the creature for themselves. However, as previously mentioned, these creatures are masters of mimicry in more ways than one. When the ancestors of Sirenus horridus made the transition from the deeper sea to the shallows, they not only set the stage for their descendants to enter an elaborate mythos, but at the shoreline they encountered another creature. Just as they were carving out a niche in the intertidal zone, the siren's progenitors began to face competition from both the sea and the land, and once again they were forced to adapt. Allow me, if you will, a slight digression. You see, as fellow scientist and marine biologist Alistair Hardy posited more than a decade ago, it seems very possible that certain ape stock, as he puts it, were forced out of the trees, perhaps due to competition, and took to life in and near shallow coastal waters. While this notion is not without controversy, certain aspects of Hardy's observations are worth considering, and indeed the human body does exhibit several features that strongly suggest adaptations to a semi-aquatic lifestyle. Once again, an in-depth discussion of this so-called aquatic ape hypothesis is beyond the scope of this presentation. In summary, however, our lack of body hair, similar to whales or hippopotamuses, our layer of subcutaneous fat, the location of our trachea, and even bipedalism itself could be direct evidence of a water-dwelling lineage of apes. I hypothesized that a group of these shore-dwelling apes intersected with the lineage of Sirenus at some point in the distant past, and in competing with each other for these resources, the lineage that would become sirens developed two forms of mimicry, nearly in tandem. The already discussed vocalizations allowed them to lure these apes into the water, where their newly elongated limbs could pull them beneath the waves. Then,
So basically what you're saying is that these water apes and these mermaids came together and they had children over time, and their children start the lineage. Okay. On a society, on a maybe on one aspect I can understand that. What do you think, chat? What do you think? Yeah, I believe so as well. Honestly, again, mermaids are not as what you thought when you were a kid. I mean, I still find them fascinating, being half human, half fish, and their survival from the deep of the ocean. My question is how, if any, how far below the ocean can the mermaids survive? How far and how deep even? If even possible.
ever so slowly, the head and face of the siren lineage began to change. Random dermal markings that could have been mistaken for eyes, or perhaps a nose, or both, increased certain individuals' likelihood of attracting their simian prey. Eventually, these markings became consistent across generations, forming an entirely false face designed to lull their victims into a false sense of security. The front of the skull flattened, the orbital sockets migrated closer to the top of the skull, and the mouth fully concealed the siren's full set of vicious teeth. Even the dorsal fin extended anteriorly, appearing to have split along the median plane, and now hangs from the supraoccipital crest at the rear of the skull, eerily reminiscent of human hair. Now, at a distance, or in the hazy oceanic fog, modern sirens, having pulled themselves to a rocky outcropping, or perhaps peering upward from beneath the water's surface, are easily mistaken for human. Add to this their unique arrangement of dorsal fins and elongated, grasping forelimbs, and it is little wonder why so many have fallen victim to their deadly allure. In fact, it is my hypothesis that the culmination of these adaptations are a stunning example of what is known as aggressive mimicry, a phenomenon easily observable in the bioluminescent lure of the anglerfish or in the arachnid genus Myrmoracne. The latter is especially notable, as its elongated cephalothorax and relatively long chelicerae project forward to very closely resemble the ants they hunt. They have even been observed to wave their front legs in a manner that simulates antennae. Needless to say, many ants are immediately fooled by these ant-mimicking spiders, a mistake that often costs them their lives. But while similar traits do have precedent in nature, Sirenus horridus is arguably the most impressive example known, and likely the first to persist with its aggressive mimicry, despite currently occupying an entirely different environment than the prey it evolved to imitate. Over the millennia, the extraordinarily adaptable siren lineage has been forced to adapt even further. A combination of factors has led to what I suspect is a gradual decline in population, and its once readily available prey has moved beyond the siren's reach. But as my findings indicate, the siren is still out there. If you travel to the region where Odysseus once sailed, you too may spot the silhouette of a beautiful woman calling out from a distant island. As you draw near, you may realize that what you thought to be a human is but a mere reflection, frozen on the face of deep time. If that happens to you, my valued listener, it may already be too late.
Well spoken, my friend. Well spoken.
The depths of the ocean conceal a myriad of secrets. There is no region of the earth so unexplored, no biome so little understood. For those species who dwell on the land, the mysteries of the sea have existed as little more than shadows passing beneath its surface.
But sometimes the line between the domains of land and sea become blurred, and in the image of the mermaid, they have even become fused together. Over the last 1,000 years, both the siren and the mermaid have become interchangeable, and the reason is understandable. Both are icons of the sea, both represent beauty and danger. As I have already shared, the siren is a different kind of beast than the legends tell. The mermaid, or merfolk if you like, is as well, but not for the reasons one might expect. In fact, when I set out to find the truth behind these famed and allegedly mythical beings, I had little idea what to expect, particularly after my findings in the case of Sirenus Horridus. What follows here, my valued listener, are the complete findings
I
my
didn't think
team and I
sirens and
dredged out
mermaids
of
were
those ocean
different.
depths. And as with so many creatures once relegated to myth, the truth of the mermaid borders on the unbelievable. A few short months before our investigation began, murmurs of a humanoid creature with the tail of a fish were received, coming from the Caribbean island of
Guess this really brings a downer on the Little Mermaid, eh, viewers? Honestly, though, even my years later, imagine showing this to a mermaid VTuber. Ooh, this would be quite the downer. This would be quite the downer indeed. Well, y'all, I think I'm going to call it here for tonight. I think we're going to call it here for tonight. I'm getting a little tired, but don't worry. I'll return tomorrow with another stream. Return some more reactions. And just continue taking a break from Darksiders. That being said, thank you all for being here tonight. You know, now that I think about it, maybe I might continue Darksiders tomorrow. Just so we can have some time to just continue the adventure. Just want to give us some time to chill, relax, and just have a great time. And not worry about the mind grind. But that being said, we'll come back tomorrow and do some more Darksiders. Because I really enjoyed tonight. I really enjoyed just sitting, watching, just really relaxing, having a chance to just catch my breath. So, furthermore, tomorrow we shall return and enjoy some more Darksiders. That being said, thank you all. Thank you for being here tonight, enjoying ourselves, enjoying some supernatural wonders. And as always, it's an honor to stream and hang with you guys. So that being said, I'm going to sign out because I am tired. So, as always, we'll be back. Same warrior time, same warrior channel. Remember, look out for each other, be the best for each other, and take care of each other. Most importantly, as Thought Potato always says, and I will always say too, you matter. Good night, everybody, and I shall see you tomorrow. Same warrior time. Peace.